Alright folks, settle in. Tonight we're taking a peek behind the dusty, probably flea-bitten curtain of medieval times. We're not talking about the fancy stuff you see in movies with knights and princesses. Nope, we're diving headfirst into the world of the young medieval bride. Think less fairy tale romance and more strategic livestock exchange. Seriously, if your idea of the Middle Ages involves sparkly dresses and charming princes, you might want to brace yourself. The reality for a young bride back then was more about suspicious-looking stew plumbing that was basically a bad joke, and marrying some guy whose main skills were fighting and complaining about the beer. This is the real deal, or as close as we can get without actually inventing a time machine, which would probably run on weak tea and disappointment anyway. This isn't a story for the squeamish or for anyone who thinks medieval and luxury spa weekend go together. So, before you doze off, hopefully in a bed that's way less drafty and definitely has fewer farm animals hanging around than a medieval one, do me a solid. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're into this kind of historical deep dive, the slightly uncomfortable kind. Oh, and pop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and maybe what century you'd rather be living in. It's always fun to see and sometimes a bit worrying. Okay, lights down low, maybe light a candle. One that smells a bit like old socks, damp earth, and a goat that's having deep thoughts about its life choices. Let's find out what it was really like to be a young bride back in the day. Spoiler, not a lot of flower crowns and romantic guitar solos. Mostly it was just a lot of waiting and trying not to attract too much attention or get stepped on by a horse. Congratulations, little Alara or Agnes, or perhaps something delightfully guttural like Griselda. You've just turned 12. Or maybe 7 if your family is particularly keen on early strategic alliances and views childhood as a correctable condition. Or, if you're particularly unlucky and your father is feeling ambitious or just really wants that extra field of turnips. 5. And guess what? Your life, that precious, fleeting thing you were just getting the hang of, mostly involving mud pies and arguing with squirrels, is about to get significantly less your own. It's betrothal time, the medieval equivalent of being put on layaway, possibly next to a slightly used suit of armor and a barrel of questionable pickles. Now, in our modern enlightened age, betrothal often involves romantic dinners, heartfelt proposals, perhaps even with a PowerPoint presentation outlining future happiness metrics, and a shiny rock that costs several months' salary. In the medieval times, it was more akin to a particularly serious livestock auction, only you were the prize heifer, and the auctioneers were your father, who probably viewed you as a valuable, if occasionally noisy asset, and some other equally enthusiastic gentleman, who owned slightly more land than your dad did, possibly a slightly less leaky roof, and had a son who wasn't actively repelled by the concept of bathing, or at least not too actively. Love? Oh, that was a quaint concept mostly found in questionable ballads, sung by traveling minstrels who probably hadn't bathed since the last plague, whose primary romantic experience involved a particularly friendly lute, and whose understanding of female anatomy was speculative at best. Marriage, for a young lady of, well, any standing really, even if that standing was mostly on a muddy patch of earth, was business. Pure, unadulterated, and often rather dull business. It was about alliances, consolidating power, ensuring that your family's patch of mud remained slightly larger, slightly less prone to flooding, and slightly further away from Lord Ethelred's aggressively territorial geese than the neighboring family's patch of mud. You, my dear, were a vital cog in this grand machine of muddy ambition. A very small, often very confused, occasionally quite dusty, and generally unconsulted cog. Your future husband, you might have met him once, possibly at a feast where he spent most of his time trying to wrestle a chicken leg from a dog, or enthusiastically demonstrating his ability to belch the alphabet, a prized social skill in some circles. Or perhaps you'd only seen a poorly rendered portrait that made him look like a startled turnip with questionable facial hair, and an expression that suggested he'd recently lost an argument with a particularly stubborn goat. Details, details. What mattered was his lineage, hopefully not too many lunatics or notorious cow thieves in the family tree. His holdings, more land, meant more pottage in theory, and whether his family had a history of conveniently dying off and leaving more land, or at least a decent set of spare blankets and a slightly less lumpy mattress. The ideal candidate was wealthy, well-connected, and possessed of a robust constitution that suggested he wouldn't keel over before producing the requisite heir. Charm and a full set of teeth were considered optional extras. Like heated seats in a modern car, the negotiations themselves would have been a masterclass in medieval diplomacy, a delicate ballet of veiled threats, exaggerated claims, and strategic deployment of lukewarm ale. Picture your father, stern-faced, probably smelling faintly of damp wool, strategic bartering, and the lingering aroma of yesterday's pottage, haggling with your future father-in-law over the dowry. My daughter comes with 3 cows, 2 of them still mostly functional. A slightly used spinning wheel only occasionally bursts into flames, a remarkable ability to not complain too loudly, at least not where anyone important can hear her, and she only has a mild fear of geese, unless they're particularly large or look at her funny, he might announce, with the air of a man selling a prize-winning turnip, to which the other esteemed gentleman, equally stern and possibly even more wool-scented, might reply, only 3 cows, and the goose situation is concerning. My son, young Reginald the slightly less awkward, was hoping for at least 4 cows, perhaps a goat with a good temperament, unlike his last wife's goat, which was clearly possessed, and a bride who doesn't flinch at poultry or express controversial opinions about the proper way to cook a squirrel. The bartering could go on for days, involving complex calculations of land value, livestock virility, and the bride's estimated lifespan, factoring in plagues, childbirth, and the general hazards of medieval cookery. And you'd be somewhere else, probably mending socks, or trying to teach a cat to fetch, or perhaps just staring blankly at a wall, contemplating the thrilling life choices being made on your behalf, and wondering if it was too late to run away and join a troupe of traveling acrobats. It probably was. Acrobats had standards. Your opinion on the matter was about as relevant as the color of the sky on a moonless night, the dietary preferences of a woodlouse, or the philosophical musings of a particularly introspective turnip. It was happening. Your fate, sealed with a handshake, probably unwashed. A contract written on parchment that smelled suspiciously like old cheese, broken dreams, and the faint lingering scent of despair, and the exchange of, well, you, and the cows. Never forget the cows. Sometimes these betrothals happened when the bride and groom were still navigating the complexities of walking without falling over, or eating soup without wearing most of it. Imagine being promised to little Timmy from down the lane when you're both still figuring out which end of a spoon to use. Consider mud a primary food group, and believe that the moon is a giant wheel of cheese. Romantic, isn't it? The idea was to secure the alliance early, before Timmy's father decided to marry him off to someone with, say, 5 cows, a slightly less pronounced fear of geese, and a family that didn't have a suspiciously high number of uncles named One-Eyed Bjorn. It was all about locking down those assets, both human and bovine. The waiting period between betrothal and actual marriage could be years. Years spent in a state of suspended animation. You weren't quite a child anymore. Your mud pie days were officially over, much to your chagrin. But you certainly weren't an adult. You weren't allowed to make any actual decisions, like what color tunic to wear or whether to set fire to your embroidery out of sheer frustration. You were betrothed, a human promissory note, slowly accruing interest in the form of domestic skills, a deepening sense of impending doom, and a growing collection of stern lectures from your mother about the importance of not embarrassing the family. You'd learn the skills deemed necessary for your future station, how to manage a household, or at least how to look like you knew what you were doing while frantically hiding the burnt bits and blaming the cat, how to embroider endless, tedious tapestries depicting heroic men doing heroic things, while you, heroically, tried not to stab yourself with the needle out of sheer boredom, or embroider a subtle message of distress into the border, and, most importantly, how to be obedient, very, very obedient, like a well-trained sheep, but with slightly better posture, and a more complex understanding of the nuances of silent resentment, any sign of a personality. That was generally discouraged, considered a design flaw, really. A good medieval bride was quiet, demure, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into the background, much like a particularly well-behaved tapestry, a patch of interesting mold, or a piece of furniture that no one particularly noticed until they tripped over it. Expressing strong opinions, displaying excessive intelligence, or, heaven forbid, having a sense of humor that wasn't directly related to someone falling into a pile of manure. These were all highly suspect traits, likely to reduce your value on the marriage market, or get you accused of witchcraft. It was a fine line. So there you are, young, betrothed, your future mapped out with all the romantic spontaneity of a tax audit, a particularly detailed schedule for cleaning out the stables, or a lecture on the theological implications of improperly churned butter. The excitement must have been palpable, or perhaps that was just the damp, or the fleas. It was probably the fleas. They were always palpable. Let's talk about your idyllic childhood, or the medieval equivalent, which mostly involved less frolicking in meadows with fluffy lambs and more learning how to not die from a splinter, an overly ambitious turnip, or the unwelcome attentions of a particularly aggressive goose. If you were a young girl destined for marriage, and let's be honest, what other destiny was there, apart from becoming a nun, which was basically marriage to God, but with more chanting and less property negotiation? Your childhood was less a period of carefree play, and more an intensive unpaid internship for the role of slightly less incompetent household manager than your mother-in-law expects, and hopefully one who doesn't set fire to the chickens or accidentally insult the visiting bishop. Playtime? That was for boys, and even then it usually involved sticks that vaguely resembled swords, a lot of enthusiastic shouting, a surprisingly high casualty rate among local shrubbery, and the occasional accidental impalement. For you, my dear, playtime was more practical. And by practical, we mean soul-crushingly dull. Your toys were miniature versions of chores. A tiny broom, perhaps, for sweeping up tiny existential crises and the dust bunnies of despair. A doll you were encouraged to swaddle, scold, and generally prepare for a life of thankless servitude, practicing for the endless parade of infants you were expected to produce, and learning the vital skill of looking stern while secretly wanting a nap and a very large glass of ale. Fun, with a capital F, and several trailing ellipses of quiet despair, punctuated by the occasional sigh that could power a small windmill. You might also have a ball made of a pig's bladder, which sounds delightful, doesn't it? Hours of bouncy bladder-why fun. Education in the modern sense was a rare luxury, like a bath that didn't involve sharing water with a confused duck, 3 of your siblings, and the family dog. If you were noble, you might learn to read a bit, enough to decipher a prayer book, mostly pictures, thankfully, or perhaps a very simple letter from your equally semi-literate husband, probably complaining about the quality of the aforementioned ale, the fact that his favorite jousting lance was a bit bendy, or the alarming news that the cat had once again eaten his best pair of socks. Writing? That was pushing it. A dangerous skill for a woman, likely to lead to independent thought or worse, poetry. Best leave that to the monks, who had more time, considerably less marriage-related admin, access to ink that wasn't made from suspicious berries and mud, and a general disinclination to write sonnets about the injustices of pottage. Your literary horizons were likely limited to the lives of saints who suffered quietly and helpful hints for removing stubborn bloodstains from wool. Your curriculum was focused on the domestic arts, and by arts we mean things that needed doing constantly, or everyone would starve, freeze, develop scurvy, or possibly resort to eating the tapestries. You learn to spin wool, a skill that sounds quaint and rustic until you realize you'll be doing it for approximately 7 hours a day, every day, until your fingers are raw, your brain has turned to fluff. You start seeing sheep in your dreams, judging your thread consistency, of course, and you develop a profound and lifelong hatred for anything remotely ovine. You learn to weave, creating fabrics that were scratchy, durable, and came in an exciting array of browns, grays, what was that stain again? Beige, and the ever-popular mud. Fashion was less about self-expression and more about not freezing to death or being mistaken for a particularly shaggy bear. Cooking was another essential. Not gourmet cuisine, mind you. We're talking pottage. Endless, bubbling, mysterious pottage. the kind of stew where ingredients went in, but their original form was rarely seen again, lost in a culinary Bermuda Triangle of root vegetables, regret, and the occasional unidentified floating object. You'd learn to identify edible roots, and, more importantly, the ones that would kill you slowly and painfully. How to make bread that could double as a doorstop, a surprisingly effective bludgeoning weapon, or a component in siege warfare, and the crucial art of not poisoning your entire family with poorly preserved meat. A vital skill, that last one, if you wanted to avoid awkward silences at dinner. Widespread foodborne illness and, mass death. You'd also learn that spices were something rich people talked about, like unicorns or well-behaved children. Your seasoning was mostly hope and perhaps a bit of dirt. If your family had any standing, you'd also learn the rudiments of household management. This didn't mean choosing tasteful decor for the Great Hall, which was probably decorated with cobwebs, the occasional bewildered bat, and the lingering scent of generations of unwashed warriors anyway. It meant knowing how much grain was left, how to ration supplies through a harsh winter, mostly by telling everyone to eat less, which was always popular, how to deal with servants who were probably stealing small items, and who could blame them. Wages were terrible, the pottage was, pottage, and the Lord was often a bit of a tyrant, and how to ensure the rushes on the floor were changed before they started actively fermenting, developing their own complex society, and possibly declaring independence. You'd also learn the delicate art of diplomacy required to get your husband to agree to buy more rushes, which was often more challenging than negotiating a peace treaty with a neighboring kingdom. Hygiene was a concept, often discussed in hushed, slightly embarrassed tones, rarely achieved with any degree of success. You might learn to wash your face, occasionally, with water that was likely shared with several other people, possibly a small farm animal, the family laundry, and the lingering ghosts of last week's dishwashing. Personal grooming involved a lot of hope, very little soap, which was a luxury item, often smelling strongly of rendered animal fat and disappointment, and the strategic use of braids to hide things like split ends, dirt, or small nesting insects. Combing your hair was a major undertaking, possibly requiring assistance, and a sturdy, wide-toothed implement that could also be used to card wool or intimidate a small dog. And then there was the training in obedience and piety. These were non-negotiable. The twin pillars of medieval womanhood. You learned to lower your eyes, to speak only when spoken to, and even then only in short, agreeable sentences, to agree with everything your father, brother, or future husband said, even if it was demonstrably insane, like his plan to teach the pigs to joust or his assertion that the moon was in fact made of green cheese, a surprisingly persistent medieval belief. The church was the center of life, the moral compass, the primary source of news, mostly about saints and impending doom, and the biggest landlord in the district. Your spiritual well-being and social acceptability depended on regular attendance at Mass, even if you didn't understand a word of the Latin. Fervent prayer, mostly for deliverance from pottage, plagues, and problematic relatives, and a healthy fear of eternal damnation, which, given the state of medieval dentistry, the ever-present threat of pottage-related illnesses, and the general discomfort of existence, probably seemed like a reasonable alternative some days. At least hell was rumored to be warm. There was little room for individuality. Your desires, your dreams, your secret wish to become a traveling juggler, a renowned scholar of turnip cultivation, or perhaps just someone who owned more than one dress, these were best kept to yourself. Locked away in the dusty attic of your soul, your purpose was clear. To be a good daughter, quiet, obedient, skilled at mending, then a good wife, quiet, obedient, skilled at pottage and air production, then a good mother, quiet, obedient, skilled at preventing your numerous offspring from accidentally killing themselves or each other. The end, any deviation from this path was met with confusion, disapproval, possibly a stern lecture from a priest who smelled faintly of incense, judgment, and a surprisingly large collection of holy relics of dubious origin, St. Cuthbert's toenail clippings, anyone? And the distinct possibility of being labeled difficult, which in medieval times was just a polite way of saying probably a witch. So your childhood was a whirlwind of practical skills, religious instruction, the slow, dawning realization that your life was not entirely your own, and that geese were, in fact, terrifying feathered agents of chaos. You were being molded, shaped, prepared for a role that had been decided for you before you even knew what a cow was, why it looked so judgmental, or that its primary function in your life would be as a bargaining chip. It was character building. In the same way that repeatedly hitting your thumb with a hammer while trying to assemble flat-pack furniture from a malevolent dimension, in the dark, during an earthquake, is character building. You learned resilience, if nothing else, and a deep, abiding suspicion of anything that clucked. The day has finally arrived. Your wedding day. After years of anticipation, or perhaps quiet dread, a series of increasingly elaborate escape plans involving a friendly goat, a poorly guarded section of the castle wall, and a surprisingly detailed map drawn on a piece of dried fish, it's time to be officially handed over. Like a slightly used but still valuable parcel, possibly containing a surprising amount of repressed anxiety, a few well-hidden doubts, and the lingering scent of your mother's helpful advice. Let's not imagine this as a modern bridal fantasy. There's no spa day with cucumber slices and calming flute music, unless the flute music was being played by a tone-deaf shepherd boy and the cucumbers were destined for the pottage. There's no champagne brunch with your giggling bridesmaids, who are probably your younger sisters, already being sized up for their own future property transfers, trying to steal your slightly less wilted flower crown, and secretly hoping you trip on your way to the altar. Your morning preparations likely involve being scrubbed with something coarse, possibly by a stern-faced aunt who views joy as a personal failing, soap as an unnecessary extravagance, and smiling as a sign of moral weakness. Your hair, which hasn't seen a proper wash in weeks and might be harboring a small but determined ecosystem of its own, will be braided, tightly, so tightly, in fact, that you might temporarily lose the ability to form complex sentences, which was probably the desired effect. Perhaps some wildflowers will be woven in. If it's the right season, someone remembered to pick them before the goats did. They haven't wilted from sheer despair or been mistaken for edible salad by a particularly hungry relative. Your wedding dress. Forget white lace, flowing trains, and delicate embroidery depicting scenes of romantic bliss. If you're noble, you'll wear the best gown you own, or one hastily made for the occasion by a seamstress who was clearly having a bad week, possibly an argument with a badger, and had a rather eccentric interpretation of flattering. It will be made of wool or perhaps linen if it's summer and you're feeling daring. Colors would be rich if your family could afford the dyes, deep reds, blues, or greens, the kind of colors that really showed off a good pottage stain. But it's still wool, itchy, heavy, and probably worn before, possibly by a distant cousin who met an unfortunate end involving a runaway cart, a very surprised flock of sheep, and a distinct lack of braking technology. If you're a peasant, you'll wear your usual clothes, maybe with a slightly cleaner apron, a hopeful expression that this won't be the day the pig escapes again and decides to attend the ceremony, and the faint aroma of wood smoke and hard-earned respectability, the height of glamour. You might even wash your feet for the occasion if you were feeling particularly decadent. The journey to the church, or perhaps just to the doorway of the church, if it's a simpler affair. The priest is feeling particularly lazy, or the weather was doing that typically medieval thing where it rained mud, would be a public spectacle. You walking demurely, eyes downcast, to avoid tripping and also to project an air of suitable humility, terror, trying not to trip over your own feet, the uneven cobblestones, a stray chicken with a death wish, or your father's overly enthusiastic pronouncements about the quality of your dowry cows. Your family, looking proud, or perhaps just relieved that they've successfully offloaded you, and can now focus on marrying off your even more problematic younger sister, and your future husband, waiting, hopefully, and ideally having made at least a token effort with a damp cloth, and possibly even combed his beard in one direction for a change. One could only dream. The ceremony itself was often conducted at the church door because why go inside when you can enjoy the fresh medieval air, redolent with the scent of, well, medieval times, a complex bouquet of unwashed humanity, livestock, and decaying organic matter. The priest intoning in Latin, a language you almost certainly don't understand but which sounds impressively solemn, and probably involves a lot of warnings about eternal damnation if you don't produce enough heirs, would go through the rites. Vows would be exchanged. These weren't necessarily personalized declarations of undying love, whispered tearfully into each other's eyes, more like a contractual agreement with a few more syllables, possibly read from a slightly grubby scroll. I, Griselda, take thee, Reginald, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold mostly the household chores, let's be honest, from this day forward, for better, for worse, mostly worse statistically speaking, for richer, for poorer, probably poorer after the dowry is spent, in sickness and in health. Good luck with that, given the state of medieval medicine, until death us do part, which could be surprisingly soon, and to obey mostly, and to not hide his favorite hunting knife, again, and to pretend to enjoy his lute playing, even if it sounds like a cat being strangled. The obey part was usually quite prominent, often underlined in the priest's mental notes, and possibly accompanied by a pointed cough from your new father-in-law. Rings might be exchanged, simple bands of iron symbolizing rust, or perhaps silver if you were moving up in the world and could afford something that wouldn't turn your finger green too conspicuously. Gold was for the seriously wealthy or those who were very good at acquiring things, possibly from recently deceased relatives. These rings weren't just symbols of love, they were symbols of the contract, proof that the deal was done, the property transferred, and that Reginald was now legally responsible for your turnip consumption and your immortal soul, in that order of importance. And then, the kiss, a brief, probably awkward public peck, possibly involving a surprising amount of beard, and the faint taste of whatever your new husband had for breakfast, likely ale and regret, the medieval equivalent of signing on the dotted line, hoping the ink doesn't smudge and wondering if it was too late to claim a sudden debilitating fear of commitment. Or geese, congratulations, you're married. Now about those cows, and did anyone remember to feed the geese? Because an unfed goose is a vengeful goose, and nobody wants that on their wedding day. The wedding feast, if there was one. And if the families hadn't bankrupted themselves on the dowry and the priest's gratuity, varied wildly. For nobility, it could be a lavish affair, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats. Swan, anyone? Tastes like chicken, if chicken had a superiority complex and a tendency to bite. Pies filled with mysterious ingredients that were best not inquired about. Ignorance was bliss, and often safer, and endless flagons of ale and wine, the quality of which was inversely proportional to the length of the speeches. Minstrels might play, slightly out of tune and with a repertoire consisting mainly of songs about heroic men, easily impressed dragons, and the tragic consequences of not paying your taxes. Jugglers might juggle precariously, and with a distinct possibility of losing an eye, or accidentally setting fire to a tapestry with a flaming torch. There would be speeches, long, rambling, and possibly incomprehensible, toasts, numerous and increasingly slurred as the evening wore on, and a general air of forced merriment, occasionally punctuated by a drunken brawl over who got the last pigeon leg, or whether Lord Ethelbert's new hat was, in fact, an affront to God. You, the bride, would sit quietly, eat little. It was unladylike to appear hungry, or to enjoy anything too much, lest you be accused of gluttony or worse, having fun, and try to look suitably bridal, which mostly meant looking a bit overwhelmed, hoping your new husband didn't get too drunk and start a brawl, or try to joust with the serving wenches, and wondering if it was too late to enact that escape plan with the goat, and if the goat would even have you at this point. For peasants, the feast might be a slightly larger portion of pottage than usual, perhaps with a bit of extra bread that wasn't quite as hard as a rock, more like a slightly stale brick, and some home-brewed ale that tasted vaguely of regret, old socks, and the faint hope that tomorrow might be slightly less awful. Celebrations were simpler, more communal, and probably involved a lot of dancing that looked suspiciously like organized stumbling, a group attempt to dislodge a persistent insect, or a ritual to appease the turnip gods. And then came the bedding ceremony. Yes, this was a thing. A truly horrifying, yet apparently essential and deeply public thing. Particularly for nobles, the consummation of the marriage was often a semi-public event, a spectator sport for the easily amused and the chronically bored. The bride and groom would be escorted to the bedchamber by a crowd of well-wishers, and a few not-so-well-wishers, probably including your new mother-in-law, taking notes, who would offer bawdy jokes, advice, mostly unsolicited, unhelpful, deeply embarrassing, and anatomically questionable, and generally make the whole experience as awkward as humanly possible. Privacy was not a medieval strong suit. It was more of a vague rumor from a distant land, possibly spread by heretics. The idea was to ensure the marriage was legally binding, because nothing says legally binding like a room full of people watching you try to get undressed. And to get the heir production process started ASAP, no pressure. Just the future of the entire lineage, the fate of the estate, and the continued approval of your increasingly impatient father-in-law, resting on your performance, in a room full of people, who were probably making bets. So, there you are, married, possibly slightly traumatized by the bedding ceremony, with a newfound appreciation for solitude and a deep-seated fear of crowds. Your new life has begun. A life of, well, we'll get to that. For now, try to enjoy the leftover pottage. It's probably the highlight of your honeymoon. And try not to think about the fact that your new mother-in-law is probably already critiquing your flower crown, your posture, and your general aura of not being good enough for her precious turnip-faced son. Welcome to wedded bliss, medieval style. You're married. The slightly too enthusiastic and possibly still drunk well-wishers have finally stumbled off to bed, possibly after offering a few more unsolicited tips on air production, or attempting to teach you a bawdy song about a milkmaid and a surprisingly agile goat. You're now officially part of a new household. Your husband's household, which, unless he's an orphan with a conveniently empty castle, a distinct lack of opinionated relatives, and a surprisingly modern understanding of personal space, means you're also now living with his entire family. Joy of joys. Prepare for the medieval equivalent of a reality TV show, only with more mud, fewer commercial breaks, and a much higher chance of contracting dysentery. Keeping up with the Deborahs, if you will, only with less plastic surgery and more plague. Let's talk about your new mother-in-law. She's been running this household since before you were born, possibly since the dawn of time itself, or at least since the last Norman invasion. She knows where every spoon is, and will notice if one is even slightly out of place, how every servant shirks their duties, and has a detailed mental spreadsheet of their transgressions, complete with color-coded threat levels, and precisely how much watered-down wine the steward has been sneaking, and is probably blackmailing him with this information. She can probably detect a speck of dust from 3 rooms away, has a sixth sense for improperly churned butter, and can tell by the twitch of your left eyebrow if you're contemplating rebellion or just have an eyelash in your eye. And now you, a young inexperienced girl whose primary life achievements to date involve not accidentally setting your own hair on fire most days, and successfully identifying which end of a needle to thread, are supposed to what exactly take over? Assist. Try not to break anything expensive. Look too cheerful, which might be misinterpreted as a sign of insufficient piety, or worse, independent thought, or accidentally poison the entire family with your first attempt at pottage. It's a delicate dance, and the floor is littered with potential social landmines, most of them laid by her, with the loving care of a seasoned military strategist. If you're lucky, she's kind, perhaps a bit weary from decades of pottage-making, sun-raising, and enduring her own husband's snoring, which could probably shake the castle foundations, but willing to teach you the ropes, or at least point you in the general direction of the less leaky buckets and the servants who are only moderately incompetent. She might even offer you a sympathetic smile when her son tracks mud all over the freshly swept rushes for the 3rd time that day. If you're unlucky, well, let's just say some medieval mothers-in-law could make a battle-hardened knight weep into his helmet, or consider taking up a monastic life of silent contemplation just to escape her withering gaze. She might see you as competition, for her son's affection, for control of the linen cupboard, for the last piece of slightly less burnt bread, an interloper, who doesn't understand her way of doing things, which is, of course, the only correct way, a drain on the household resources, another mouth to feed, another body to clothe in itchy wool, or simply another soul to criticize with laser-like precision and a running commentary that would make a drill sergeant proud. Your attempts at managing the household will be met with sighs long, dramatic, and laden with inspoken disappointment, raised eyebrows that could probably skewer a small bird, the occasional muttered comment about how things were done in her day, which, by all accounts, was a golden age of perfectly folded linen, impeccably behaved chickens, sons who actually listened, and a distinct lack of uppity young brides, and a general aura of disapproval that could curdle milk at 50 paces and make even the most confident of geese reconsider their life choices. Your new sisters-in-law, if any, could be allies or adversaries, or, more likely, a confusing combination of both, depending on the day, the phase of the moon, and whether you accidentally used their favorite embroidery thread. They might welcome you with open arms, eager for a new companion in the endless cycle of domestic chores, eye-rolling at their brother's antics and complaining about their mother. Or they might view you with suspicion. Another rival for attention, affection, the slightly less lumpy mattress, the last non-moldy apple, or the chance to marry that vaguely eligible and only slightly cross-eyed knight who occasionally visits. It's a medieval sisterhood, and the initiation rites can be brutal, possibly involving hidden thistles in your bedding or accidentally spilling ale on your only decent tunic. And your husband, he's probably off hunting, or training, or discussing important man things like the price of iron, the likelihood of another skirmish with the neighboring lord, who, it turns out, is also his second cousin and owes him money, or which dog has the most impressive flatulence, a surprisingly common topic of conversation in medieval mead halls. He's not going to be holding your hand as you navigate the treacherous waters of his family dynamics, explaining why Aunt Mildred insists on communicating exclusively through interpretive dance involving root vegetables, or defending you when his mother implies that your needlework looks like it was done by a drunken badger. You're on your own, kid, armed with your dowry cows, which are probably already being eyed greedily by your new father-in-law, a rapidly diminishing sense of optimism, and the dawning realization that happily ever after might involve a lot more strategic smiling and nodding than the minstrels let on. The living conditions themselves might be an adjustment. Even if you came from a relatively comfortable noble family, you might find your new home rustic. Charmingly so, if your definition of charming includes drafts that could extinguish a candle at 20 paces, questionable smells emanating from undisclosed locations, and an ongoing battle with rodents, who seem to view the tapestries as a personal buffet and your bed as a convenient latrine. Castles, for all their romantic imagery, were cold, drafty, and often smelly. Stone walls did not make for good insulation, and the concept of cozy usually involved huddling near a fire that produced more smoke than heat, and possibly a few hallucinogenic fumes if the wood was damp. The great hall, where everyone ate, socialized, i.e., shouted over the noise of the dogs and the minstrels, and often slept in a companionable heap of unwashed humanity, was a bustling, noisy, smoky place, filled with the aroma of roasting meat, wet dogs, unwashed warriors, and the lingering scent of centuries of spilled ale. Privacy was a concept that hadn't quite caught on. It was more of a theoretical state, like a well-behaved toddler or a dragon that tidied up after itself. If you wanted a moment alone, you probably had to hide in the garderobe, which came with its own unique set of olfactory challenges. Your bedchamber, if you were lucky enough to have one separate from the main hall, and the snoring retainers, who could often be heard from several counties away, would be small. The bed itself, a large wooden frame with ropes or leather straps for support, which had a tendency to sag in the middle, creating a human taco effect, would be piled with straw or feather mattresses, if you were very fancy, or had recently plucked a lot of geese much to their annoyance, and heavy wool blankets that felt like being hugged by a damp, slightly judgmental sheep. And yes, you'd be sharing it, not just with your husband, but probably with a few fleas who considered it prime real estate, and were raising large, extended flea families in the seams. The occasional mouse might scurry past on a reconnaissance mission, possibly looking for fallen crumbs or a quiet place to expire. And then there was the lingering scent of medieval life, which is to say, a complex bouquet of wood smoke, old food, unidentifiable dampness, and profound regret, Sweet dreams. If you married into a peasant family, your new home would be even simpler. And by simpler, we mean significantly more earthy. A 1 or 2 room hut, often shared with livestock during the winter for warmth and added aroma, and the delightful sound of a cow chewing its cud 3 feet from your head. The floor would be packed earth, which had the charming habit of turning into mud whenever it rained, or whenever someone spilled something, which was often. The roof thatched and prone to leaks, providing an impromptu indoor water feature, usually directly over your bed. The furniture, sparse, utilitarian, and probably carved by someone whose primary tool was an axe, a vague sense of optimism, and a complete disregard for right angles. Your mother-in-law would still be there, though. Some things are universal, like the disapproving stare of a woman who thinks you're not scrubbing the pottage pot correctly, or that your method of chasing chickens is all wrong. You'd be expected to quickly learn the rhythms of this new household. Who did what? Usually you did most of it. When meals were served, usually 2 a day, a main meal mid-morning that was basically breakfast and lunch combined, designed to fuel a long day of back-breaking labor, and a lighter supper in the evening that was mostly leftovers, hope, and a silent prayer that the bread wasn't too stale. What your specific duties were. Everything your mother-in-law didn't feel like doing. And most importantly, how to stay out of your mother-in-law's way when she was in a mood, which could be triggered by anything from a slightly overcooked turnip, the alignment of the stars, a particularly insolent goat, or the mere sight of your cheerful, youthful face. It was a period of intense adaptation, of learning new rules, new smells, new levels of exhaustion. You were a stranger in a strange land, even if that land was only a few miles from where you grew up and still smelled faintly of your childhood goats, who were probably better behaved than your new in-laws. Your old life was over. Your new life, well, it was just beginning, and it was probably going to involve a lot more mending, a lot more sighing, a surprising number of conversations about the emotional state of various farm animals, and the slow, dawning realization that your dowry cows were probably having a better time than you were. Welcome to the family. Try not to break anything, or cry too loudly. So, you've settled into your new home. Or rather, you're attempting to carve out a small, non-threatening niche for yourself, amidst the established chaos of your husband's family, a bit like a very polite mouse trying to find a crumb in a room full of cats, who are all judging your crumb-finding technique. The initial flurry of wedding-related activity, and unsolicited advice, mostly from your mother-in-law, about the proper way to fold linen, stir pottage, breathe, has died down, and now you're faced with the thrilling reality of your day-to-day existence as a young medieval bride. Prepare for the grind. A grind so profound it could probably power a small mill if mills ran on sheer monotony. The silent screams of the domestically overburdened, and the pervasive scent of damp wool. Your days are no longer your own. They belong to the household, to your husband when he remembers you exist outside of mealtimes or when he needs a button sewn on his tunic, and to the endless cyclical demands of medieval life, which seem to involve a disproportionate amount of mud, mysterious stains, and arguments about whose turn it is to fetch water from the suspiciously murky well. You rise early, often before dawn, when the only creatures stirring are the rats, who are always stirring, probably plotting world domination from behind the flour sacks, the roosters, who seem to have a personal vendetta against sleep, and possibly against you specifically, and possibly a very confused owl wondering what it ever did to deserve being reincarnated in the Middle Ages. The church bells, those relentless medieval alarm clocks, would clang, signaling the start of another day of, well, more of the same, but perhaps with a different flavor of pottage if you're lucky, or if someone accidentally dropped a new kind of root vegetable into the pot. If you're a lady of a noble household, your responsibilities are managerial, though no less demanding. You are, in essence, the COO of a small, inefficient, and perpetually under-resourced corporation whose primary product is survival, with a side of complaining about the neighbors, and the occasional poorly planned siege. Your office is the entire castle or manor, including the bits that smell faintly of despair, old cheese, and the ghosts of forgotten hunting dogs. Your staff is a motley crew of servants, each with their own quirks, grievances, an uncanny ability to be elsewhere when needed, a shared talent for looking busy while achieving very little, and a collective expertise in the art of strategic incompetence. They are loyal, in their own way, mostly to the concept of getting through the day with minimal effort and maximal pilfering of small, easily concealed foodstuffs. Your first task might be to oversee the kitchens. This is not Hell's Kitchen, medieval edition, though the levels of stress and questionable hygiene might be comparable. You're ensuring there's enough food for the day, that the bread isn't too moldy. A little mold builds character, too much mold builds an interesting legal case or a new pet, that the pottage isn't actively sentient, attempting to escape the pot or communicating with otherworldly entities. You confer with the cook, who probably knows more about running the household than you do, has seen things that would make your hair curl, possesses a vocabulary of curses that would make a sailor blush, and will pretend otherwise. Mostly, while subtly judging your lack of pottage-related intuition and your naive belief that vegetables should be identifiable. You check the stores, the grain, possibly weevil-infested, the salted meats, which might be older than you are, and could probably be used as a weapon in a pinch, the barrels of ale, the lifeblood of the household. Running out was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. You'd also have to mediate disputes between the kitchen staff, which usually involved accusations of stolen bacon, improper stirring techniques, or consorting with suspiciously intelligent rats. Then there's the linen. So much linen. It breeds in the dark like dust bunnies. Sheets, tablecloths, tunics, undergarments, of varying degrees of cleanliness, all needing to be washed. A monumental task involving lye that could strip paint, scrubbing boards that could double as instruments of torture, a lot of hauling water from a distant and possibly haunted well, and the distinct possibility of developing forearms like a blacksmith or a very enthusiastic wrestler, mended because everything was always falling apart, a metaphor for medieval life itself, and stored away from the rats who had a particular fondness for well-worn undergarments and the damp which was everywhere. You'd supervise the laundresses and seamstresses, or perhaps do a good portion of the finer needlework yourself, because nothing says noble lady like spending 8 hours a day hunched over a piece of fabric, slowly going blind, and creating intricate tapestries depicting heroic family ancestors who probably bore little resemblance to their actual, less heroic, and significantly smellier selves. Embroidery was a ladylike pursuit, a way to pass the endless hours while creating tapestries that would hopefully impress visitors with your family's piety, their heroic and probably exaggerated deeds, their surprisingly good taste in thread colors, or at least their ability to afford a lot of thread. You'd also be responsible for the general upkeep of the household, ensuring the rushes on the floor were fresh, or at least not actively composting, attracting a new, more ambitious form of wildlife, or attempting to unionize, that candles were made. A smelly, messy business involving rendered animal fat and a lot of patience, that herbs were dried for medicinal or culinary use, or to try and mask the other, less pleasant household aromas, like the smell of wet dog, old cheese, and simmering resentment, that the dogs hadn't eaten the tapestries again, or worse, the visiting bishop's hat, which could lead to an interdict and a significant drop in local property values. You might also be in charge of brewing ale or making wine, vital skills for ensuring household harmony or at least a manageable level of drunken stupor. If your husband is the lord of the manor, you might also have duties related to the estate. Listening to tenants' complaints, which were numerous, often involved runaway pigs, accusations of witchcraft related to suspiciously successful turnips, boundary disputes that had been raging for generations, and were rarely resolved to anyone's satisfaction, usually ending in a vague promise to look into it, and a hasty retreat, keeping track of accounts. Simple arithmetic, thankfully, because advanced mathematics was considered a dark art, possibly involving demons and fractions, and generally representing your husband's authority when he was off doing important lordly things, like fighting, feuding, falling off his horse during a hunt, or engaging in lengthy ale-fueled discussions about the theological implications of cheese. This often meant making difficult decisions, like whether to hang the poacher or just confiscate his trousers, and all of this while looking presentable, or at least not actively alarming. Even if presentable, just meant your wool dress was relatively free of soup stains, your hair was neatly braided, and possibly hiding a family of spiders or a small, well-behaved squirrel, and you hadn't accidentally set anything or anyone on fire that morning. Makeup was minimal, often consisting of a bit of berry juice for the lips and cheeks if you were feeling particularly daring, or a dusting of lead-based powder if you wanted to achieve that fashionable pallor and also slowly poison yourself. If you're a peasant bride, your daily grind is more hands-on, and by hands-on, we mean your hands will be permanently covered in mud, animal dung, the faint lingering scent of disappointment, and probably a few splinters. You're not supervising servants. You are the servant, the cook, the laundress, the farmhand, the child care provider, the official goat wrangler, the turnip whisperer, and the person who has to deal with whatever unidentifiable mess the dog just made, all rolled into one tired, probably aching and slightly bewildered package. You are the medieval Swiss Army knife of domestic labor. You'd be up with the sun, or possibly before it if the rooster was feeling particularly malicious, or if a cow had decided to give birth in your bed, tending to the animals, milking the cow, if you had one, and if it was in the mood to be milked, which was never a guarantee, as cows can be surprisingly opinionated, feeding the chickens, who would repay you by laying eggs in the most inconvenient places imaginable, chasing the errant goat who had, once again, decided to eat the roof your laundry, the neighbor's prize-winning cabbage. You'd prepare the morning meal. More pottage, is there an echo in here? More hard bread, useful for teething babies and fending off small predators, and a silent prayer that today wasn't the day the weevils in the flour decided to stage a rebellion and demand better working conditions. Then it was off to the fields with your husband, especially during planting or harvest season, bending, lifting, reaping, under the hot sun or in the biting wind, until your back screamed for mercy your hands were raw, and your soul quietly packed its bags, left a note saying gone fishing, and never returned. Medieval farming was backbreaking work, and women did their fair share, often while also carrying a baby, arguing with a stubborn donkey, and trying to remember what joy felt like. Back at the hut there were children to care for. We'll get to the joys of medieval motherhood shortly. Try to contain your excitement, or at least your screams. Water to fetch from the well or stream, which was probably also used by the local livestock for their ablutions, and by the village idiot for his surprisingly frequent bathing rituals. Firewood to gather, which often involved venturing into slightly terrifying woods that were rumored to be haunted by wolves, bandits, or particularly grumpy squirrels. Clothes to mend by the dim light of a single candle, if you could afford one, or the flickering hearth, while simultaneously trying to stop the toddler from eating a spider or using your best needle as a toothpick. Spinning, weaving, brewing ale, a vital skill, as water was often a gamble best not taken, and ale was considered a nutritious part of the daily diet, even for children, which explains a lot about medieval decision-making. The tasks were endless, repetitive, and rarely came with a thank you, a day off, or even a slightly less lumpy piece of straw to sleep on. There was no downtime, no me time, no self-care Sundays involving artisanal pottage, a mud mask, and a quiet hour with a good and probably illicit book. Leisure was a foreign concept, possibly a mythical beast spoken of in hushed tones by exhausted peasants, like the unicorn, or a day without chores. Evenings were spent preparing for the next day, sharpening tools, soaking beans, mending yet another hole in that one perpetually disintegrating tunic, or perhaps huddled around the fire, mending tools, telling stories, mostly about how hard work was, how unfair the Lord was, or how that one goat was definitely possessed by a mischievous demon with a penchant for eating laundry, or just staring into the flames, wondering if life had anything more to offer than slightly less lumpy pottage, and perhaps a brief respite from the fleas. And through it all, there was the constant underlying pressure, to be efficient, to be frugal, because waste was a sin, and also because there was never enough of anything, to be obedient, to your husband, to the priest, to the Lord, to basically anyone with a louder voice or a bigger stick, to not complain, at least not where anyone important could hear you, though the chickens were probably excellent confidants, to be a good wife, whatever that meant in a world where survival itself was a daily achievement, A clean pair of socks was the height of luxury, and the most exciting event of the week was finding an unbruised apple. You might ask yourself, as you scrubbed yet another pot that seemed to be actively regenerating grime, or mended yet another tunic that had more holes than fabric, or tried to coax a reluctant flame from damp firewood in the pouring rain, is this it? Is this all my life is going to be? And why, oh why, does everything perpetually smell faintly of damp dog, wood smoke, and shattered dreams? And the silent, drafty answer from the medieval walls, possibly accompanied by the distant mooing of a discontented cow, would be, pretty much, now about that pottage, it's not going to stir itself, you know. And the dog needs a walk, and the roof is leaking again, and I think the baby just ate a spider. Such was the glamorous, thrill-a-minute existence of the young medieval bride. You've mastered the art of looking busy while your mother-in-law critiques your every move, a skill that should honestly be an Olympic sport, possibly involving synchronized sighing and competitive eye-rolling. You can now distinguish between 6 different kinds of mud by smell alone, have developed a complex internal ranking system for their relative stickiness, and can predict the weather based on the ache in your left knee. A surprisingly accurate, if somewhat depressing, meteorological tool. You're a fully integrated medieval wife. So what's next on the agenda, now that you've perfected the art of the non-committal nod and the strategically deployed yes, dear? Ah, yes, babies. Lots and lots of babies, or at least the relentless, society-mandated, and often physically grueling attempt to produce lots and lots of babies, because in medieval times, your womb was basically public property, a vital resource for the continuation of the family line, the estate, and the local priest's christening revenue. In the medieval world, a woman's primary purpose, especially a married woman's, was to produce children, specifically male children, heirs, an heir to inherit the land, which was probably mostly mud and rocks. The title, which might be something grand like Lord of the Slightly Damp Meadow, the slightly rusty family sword, which had seen better days, and possibly a few too many bar fights, the ongoing feud with the neighbors, usually over a disputed pigsty or an insult uttered 3 generations ago, and possibly a collection of surprisingly aggressive hunting dogs with questionable table manners. A spare was also good, a sort of biological backup plan, just in case the heir had an unfortunate encounter with a boar, a plague, a badly cooked turnip, an overly enthusiastic game of medieval dodge-the-falling masonry, or simply decided to run off and join a monastery to escape the family drama. Daughters? Well, they were useful for marrying off to secure more alliances, acquire more cows, the medieval equivalent of a diversified investment portfolio, and generally expand the family's sphere of influence and misery. But they weren't heirs. They were valuable trade goods, essentially. The pressure to produce a son was immense, like wearing a full suit of armor in a sauna, while simultaneously juggling live eels and reciting the genealogy of your husband's entire extended family, backwards. From the moment you were married, and possibly even before, during those awkward betrothal years when you were mostly trying to avoid eye contact with your future turnip-faced husband, and wondering if he knew how to use a fork, the expectation to conceive would hang in the air, thicker than the smoke in the great hall after a particularly enthusiastic and poorly ventilated feast. Every month that passed without news of a pregnancy would be met with concerned glances from your husband, who might start to question your functionality, pitying looks from other women who had already produced their quota of squalling infants, and perhaps a few unsolicited fertility tips from your mother-in-law, involving questionable herbs, even more questionable rituals, like burying a toad under your bed or drinking water blessed by a one-eyed priest, and a strong suggestion that perhaps you weren't praying hard enough, thinking sufficiently fertile thoughts, or eating enough turnips. Turnips were apparently the medieval superfood for everything from infertility to a bad haircut. When pregnancy did occur, it wasn't a time for gender reveal parties, which would have involved a lot of confused shrugging, as ultrasound technology was still a few centuries off, and the best they could do was guess based on the shape of your bump or the frequency of your morning sickness, both notoriously unreliable indicators, and adorable baby showers, where the gifts would likely be a slightly less lumpy piece of straw for the crib, a lecture on the importance of swaddling from your mother-in-law, and perhaps a small carved wooden crucifix to ward off evil spirits and teething pain. It was a time of cautious optimism mixed with a healthy dose of terror, and a sudden, intense craving for pickled onions, which were, of course, out of season, or possibly just a figment of your hormonally imbalanced imagination. Pregnancy and childbirth were incredibly dangerous in the medieval period. This wasn't a journey you undertook with a team of obstetricians, a pristine hospital wing, a curated playlist of calming whale songs, and a doula named Moonflower. This was you, a midwife, who might also be the village goat herder, the local alewife, the woman who read fortunes in chicken entrails, or just a woman who'd seen a lot of babies arrive and had strong opinions and even stronger hands, and a lot of prayer, and possibly a lucky rabbit's foot, of dubious efficacy and even more dubious origin. Prenatal care? Non-existent, unless you count being told to avoid looking at misshapen vegetables, lest your child be born resembling a particularly unfortunate parsnip, or being advised to wear a pouch of dried frog skin around your neck to ensure an easy delivery. You'd continue with your daily chores for as long as physically possible, because the pottage wouldn't stir itself, the goats still needed wrangling, and your husband still expected his ale to be poured, pregnant or not. Diet? Whatever was available, which often wasn't much, and certainly didn't involve prenatal vitamins, organic kale smoothies, helpful pamphlets on folic acid, or a sympathetic partner rushing out at midnight for ice cream and pickles. Medical advice mostly consisted of don't look at a hair, or your child will have a hair lip, avoid drafts, angry badgers, and men with suspicious coughs, and pray really, really hard, and maybe sacrifice a small chicken to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. Can't hurt, unless you're the chicken. When labor began, it was an ordeal. A marathon of pain, fear, and bodily fluids. There was no pain relief beyond perhaps some herbal concoctions that might make you drowsy, slightly less aware of the agony, or possibly just convince you that you were a teapot giving birth to a tiny, screaming tea cozy. The midwife would assist, using skills passed down through generations, some helpful, like massage or encouraging words, some actively harmful, like yanking on the baby, or applying strange poultices made of unidentifiable substances, and some just plain weird, like tying a piece of red string around your ankle to ward off evil spirits, which were apparently very fashion-conscious and easily distracted by primary colors. Hygiene was not a priority. Hands were rarely washed. Instruments, if any were used, were not sterilized. Infection was rampant, and often considered just another charming feature of the birthing process, like the screaming or the existential dread. If the birth was straightforward, a rare and blessed event like finding a gold coin in your pottage, there would be relief, joy, quickly followed by exhaustion, and then the immediate anxiety of whether the child would survive the next 5 minutes. If it was a boy, even more so, the celebrations would be slightly louder, the ale would flow a bit more freely, and your husband might even crack a smile, a fleeting, quickly suppressed smile, lest he appear too emotional. If complications arose, a breech birth, prolonged labor, hemorrhaging, the outcome was often tragic for both mother and child. Many young brides did not survive their first, second, or even third childbirth. It was a brutal lottery, and the house, or rather the Grim Reaper, always won in the end, and if the child was born alive and seemed healthy, the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The medieval world was a minefield for infants. Infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Diseases we barely think about today, measles, smallpox, dysentery, whooping cough, even a common cold, could be death sentences for a medieval baby. It was less bless you when a baby sneezed, and more better start digging a tiny grave just in case, and perhaps order a slightly smaller coffin. Malnutrition was common, as food was often scarce and a mother's own health might be compromised. Accidents happened. Medieval households were not exactly baby-proofed, with open hearths, sharp objects, and roaming livestock all posing significant hazards. Many children didn't live to see their first birthday. Some estimates suggest up to half of all children died before the age of 5, a statistic that would make even the most stoic medieval parent reach for the strong ale, and possibly question the benevolence of a god who seemed to have a particular grudge against toddlers. So, as a young bride, you would likely experience multiple pregnancies, multiple childbirths, and tragically, multiple losses, each one a physical and emotional toll. A fresh layer of grief added to the already heavy burden of medieval existence. You'd be expected to grieve quietly, briefly. There were chores to be done, after all, and other, hopefully more resilient children to care for. And then get on with the business of trying for another heir, because the family lineage wouldn't perpetuate itself. Those dowry cows weren't getting any younger, and your husband was starting to look at you with that "are you even trying" expression again. There was no postpartum care as we know it, no gentle recovery period, with supportive nurses, lactation consultants, and helpful partners bringing you tea and sympathy. You'd be back to your duties as soon as possible, often while still recovering, bleeding, and now with a newborn to care for, who by the way probably also smelled faintly of goat, and had an uncanny ability to projectile vomit at the most inconvenient moments. Breastfeeding was the norm, and often continued for 2 years or more, providing vital nutrition and some immunity to the child. But if you were a noblewoman, you might employ a wet nurse, a peasant woman, often one who had recently lost her own child, who would nurse your baby, frequently at the expense of her own offspring's health, in a system that was as practical as it was heartbreakingly cruel. The cycle was relentless. Conceive, carry, birth, nurse, grieve, repeat. It was the central, defining, and often most dangerous aspect of a medieval woman's life. A constant dance with death, a perpetual state of hope and fear. And through it all, you were expected to remain strong, pious, and uncomplaining. Because that, my dear, was your duty. Your glorious, terrifying, heartbreaking, and occasionally quite sticky, profoundly exhausting, and almost certainly traumatic duty. But hey, at least you got a new title, Mother. Assuming you both survived, of course. You're a young medieval bride, surrounded by the constant threat of plague, which was always lurking like a creepy uncle at a family gathering. Famine, a regular seasonal occurrence like bad weather or your husband's inexplicable desire to wear a particular moth-eaten hat. Your mother-in-law's disapproval, a force of nature in itself, capable of wilting flowers and curdling milk with a single glance, and a lingering suspicion that the cat is plotting against you. It probably was. Medieval cats were notoriously shifty. Surely, with all these existential threats, you're taking excellent care of your health and hygiene, adhering to a strict regimen of cleanliness and preventative medicine. Let's just say the medieval definition of wellness was slightly different from ours. It mostly involved not being actively on fire, currently decomposing, or mistaken for a particularly unfortunate scarecrow, and preventative medicine usually meant praying really hard and avoiding anyone who looked a bit green. Personal hygiene was an adventure, a largely unmapped territory, full of surprising discoveries, most of them unpleasant and many of them alive. Bathing was not a daily ritual, or even a weekly one, or, for many, a monthly one, unless they accidentally fell into a river, which, given the state of most medieval rivers, might actually make them dirtier. Full immersion baths were a luxury, requiring a lot of effort, hauling water which was heavy and often came from a source of questionable purity, heating it over a fire, which was smoky, time-consuming, and used up precious firewood, and finding a tub that didn't leak too badly, wasn't currently occupied by a confused chicken, or hadn't recently been used to wash the dog ferment ale store turnips. For most people, washing involved a quick splash of cold water on the face and hands from a basin. Maybe, if they remembered, and if the water wasn't frozen solid or hadn't been claimed by a family of particularly assertive frogs. Sometimes a damp cloth was employed, moved vaguely around the more accessible body parts. It was less cleansing and more rearranging the dirt. Soap? It existed in a rudimentary form, but it was often harsh, made from animal fat, often rancid, and lye, which could strip paint or skin, and not something you'd use liberally, lest you accidentally remove your entire epidermis and reveal the quivering mass of anxiety beneath. It was less gentle cleansing bar with soothing chamomile, and more industrial-strength degreaser with a hint of existential despair. Deodorant, perfume, these were for the very wealthy, the incredibly vain, or those attempting to mask a truly epic level of personal aroma. And even then, their primary function was often to mingle with the underlying bouquet of unwashed bodies, equally unwashed clothing, and the general miasma of medieval life, creating a new, even more complex, and often quite startling olfactory experience. You didn't smell good. You just smelled less like a goat than usual, or perhaps like a goat that had recently frolicked in a field of slightly wilted herbs, and then rolled in something unidentifiable. The goal was not to be fragrant, but to be slightly less offensive to the nostrils than the person standing next to you. Your single woolen dress, the one you wore day in and day out through sickness and health, through pottage spills, accidental encounters with farm animals, and the occasional impromptu wrestling match with a disobedient child, it wasn't going into a washing machine with gentle detergent, a delicate cycle, and a fabric softener that smelled of spring meadows. It might get a spot clean if something particularly egregious happened, like a direct hit from a rogue pigeon, an unfortunate incident involving an exploding meat pie, or if your husband used it to wipe his greasy hands, or perhaps an airing out if the weather was fine. The wind wasn't blowing from the direction of the tannery pigsty local battlefield, and you could find a bush that wasn't already occupied by drying laundry or a sleeping peasant. But mostly it just accumulated life. Dust, sweat, food stains, the faint aroma of wood smoke, despair, whatever the dog rolled in, and a rich patina of medieval existence. This was considered normal. In fact, some believed that too much washing could open the pores and let in disease, the dreaded bad air. So that layer of grime, protective, probably, like a very personal, very smelly, and surprisingly insulating suit of armor. It also made you less appealing to kidnappers, which was a small but not insignificant perk. Dental hygiene was similarly rustic, and by rustic, we mean horrifyingly primitive, and likely to result in a lifelong fear of anything entering your mouth, including food. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist. People might chew on a twig, often hazel or willow for that authentic woody flavor, to freshen their breath, or at least rearrange the existing bad smells into a slightly less offensive configuration, or rub their teeth with a cloth and some salt, sage, or powdered chalk. Tooth powders made from crushed bone, oyster shells, powdered charcoal, or even dried mouse brains, yes really, were sometimes used with varying degrees of success, abrasion, and general unpleasantness. But mostly, teeth were left to their own devices to battle the forces of decay, armed only with hope, a general lack of sugary snacks, one of the few perks of medieval poverty, though honey was a known culprit, and a profound sense of resignation, which meant that by your 20s, you likely had a few missing gaps were fashionable, in a haven't seen a dentist in my life sort of way. A few more aching, a dull throbbing reminder of your mortality, and breath that could stun a small badger at 20 paces, or possibly be used to fumigate a granary, or start a small fire in a pinch. Toothaches were common, a constant throbbing soundtrack to medieval life, often leading to sleepless nights, a diet of soft pottage, and a general air of misery. And the cure often involved having the offending tooth pulled by the local barber surgeon, who also cut hair, performed minor surgeries, and probably dabbled in amateur taxidermy, without anesthetic, unless you count the screaming as a mild sedative, or the barber surgeon's off-key humming of a cheerful plague-related ditty. Good times. The wealthier might have gold or ivory toothpicks, but these were more for show than for actual cleaning. What about when you got sick? Medieval medicine was a fascinating, if terrifying, blend of herbal remedies, some surprisingly effective, many utterly useless. Superstition. Lots and lots of superstition, involving everything from lucky charms to avoiding cross-eyed cats on a Tuesday. Sheer guesswork, often based on what worked or didn't kill the last patient, and a surprising amount of bodily fluids, both as diagnostic tools and as ingredients in remedies. Illness was often attributed to an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, a delightful quartet that apparently governed everything from your mood to your bowel movements, or perhaps to divine displeasure. God was apparently very easily annoyed in the Middle Ages, and often expressed his displeasure through boils, agues, and inconveniently timed lightning strikes, or maybe just bad air, miasma, which, given the general state of sanitation and the proximity of open sewers, was actually a pretty reasonable guess. Or of course witchcraft. When in doubt, blame a witch, or a disgruntled elf. If you had a fever, the treatment might be bloodletting. Yes, intentionally draining some of your precious lifeblood into a bowl, or onto the floor if things got messy, to rebalance your humors, a process that often left you weaker, paler, more likely to faint into your pottage, and generally less equipped to fight off whatever was actually ailing you. Leeches were also popular for this purpose, tiny, slimy, blood-sucking physicians who worked for worms. Literally, they were often kept in jars of worms, and were considered a cutting-edge medical technology. Got a headache? Perhaps some trepanning. Drilling a small hole in your skull with a sharp instrument to release the evil spirits, or the pressure, or possibly just to see what was in there. Spoiler. It mostly just released more evil spirits, a lot of blood, a few bone fragments, and possibly your brains. This procedure had a surprisingly high survival rate, if by survival you mean didn't die immediately on the table, but might develop a nasty infection and expire a week later. Herbal remedies were widely used, and some were genuinely effective. Willow bark for pain, it contains salicin, similar to aspirin. Poppy for sedation, a bit too effective sometimes, leading to what was known as a very long nap. Various herbs for digestive issues, which were legion given the diet of pottage, hard bread, and hope. But many cures were based on the doctrine of signatures, the idea that a plant's appearance indicated what it could treat. So, lungwort, which looks a bit like a diseased lung, charmingly, was used for respiratory problems. Walnuts, which resemble tiny brains, were good for head ailments. Abright, a flower with markings like an eye, was used for eye problems. Makes perfect sense if you don't think about it too hard. Or at all, really. Which was often the preferred medieval approach to complex problems, like medicine or why the chickens kept escaping. Other remedies involved ingredients like powdered unicorn horn, probably narwhal tusk, mummy dust, yes, actual ground-up mummies, a popular cure-all, and a wide variety of animal excrement, don't ask. Women's health was a particular area of creativity, and by creativity, we mean a bewildering array of treatments that ranged from the merely useless, like wearing a dead weasel around your neck to cure a toothache, to the actively dangerous, like douching with wine mixed with pepper to treat, well, best not to inquire. Menstrual issues, pregnancy complications, and hysteria, a catch-all term for pretty much any female ailment that baffled male physicians, which was most of them, including things like reading too much or having opinions, were treated with a bewildering array of concoctions, rituals, and stern lectures on the importance of being less hysterical and more like a quiet, uncomplaining piece of furniture. Many of these cures were more harmful than helpful, and often involved ingredients best left undescribed or at least not discussed before dinner. Hospitals, or rather hospices, existed, usually run by religious orders like the Knights Hospitaller or various monastic communities, but they were often places for the destitute, the chronically ill, and the dying. Rather than centers of active curative healing, they provided shelter, food, more pottage, and spiritual comfort, but medical intervention was limited. If you were sick, you were generally cared for at home, by the women of the household, using traditional remedies passed down through generations, a lot of prayer, and a healthy dose of, well, at least it's not the plague yet. And if it was the plague, well, then it was mostly just a lot of prayer, and trying to avoid being boarded up in your own house. So, as a young medieval bride, you lived in a world where a simple infection could be a death sentence, where hygiene was an afterthought, or possibly a sin, depending on which priest you asked, and where the best medical advice you might receive was to avoid drafts, pray harder, confess your sins, because your illness was probably your fault anyway, and possibly sacrifice a chicken just to cover all bases. It's a miracle anyone survived, really, which just makes their resilience all the more impressive and slightly terrifying, and makes you want to go wash your hands thoroughly, and maybe hug your doctor. You're a wife now, a medieval wife. This comes with a certain status, or more accurately, a certain set of expectations, limitations, a lifetime supply of unsolicited opinions, and a very specific, socially mandated place in the world, and that place, my dear, was generally about 3 steps behind your husband, to avoid accidentally outshining him or getting hit by any stray arrows aimed in his general direction, slightly to his left, the less important side obviously, preferably not speaking unless spoken to, and even then only in short, agreeable, and ideally monosyllabic utterances, or breathing too loudly. That could also be problematic, especially if he was trying to concentrate on his pottage, his ale, or his important thoughts about the strategic deployment of manure. Legally, you were somewhat of a non-entity, a charming accessory to your husband's existence, like a particularly useful but not overly talkative piece of furniture. Upon marriage, a woman often entered a state of coverture, a delightful legal fiction, meaning her legal identity was subsumed by her husband's, much like a small, insignificant stream flowing into a vast, muddy, and often rather unpredictable river. He controlled her property, including her dowry, those precious cows we talked about, which were now his precious cows to do with as he pleased, which might involve trading them for a new hawk or losing them in a game of dice. He could make decisions on her behalf, even if those decisions involved, say, trading your favorite goat for a slightly dented helmet, or deciding that your ancestral tapestries would look much better lining the dog's kennel. He was, in essence, her legal guardian, her representative in the eyes of the law, even if she was perfectly capable of managing an entire estate, negotiating with hostile neighbors, fending off a badger attack, and balancing the household accounts while he was off losing at jousting, or more likely, losing his temper at jousting because his horse had once again developed a will of its own, and decided to take a nap mid-charge. If you committed a crime, he might be held responsible. If he committed a crime, well, that was just Tuesday. Your primary sphere of influence, your designated arena of power, was the household. This was your domain, your kingdom of chaos. The smooth running of the domestic machine, the food, which was rarely smooth, and often involved a lot of frantic stirring to prevent it from becoming a solid, unidentifiable mass. The clothing, which was mostly wool and mostly in need of mending. The children, who were often sticky, noisy, and prone to escaping. The servants, if any, and if they hadn't run off to join a traveling circus or been poached by a wealthier neighbor with better pottage. This was your responsibility, and it was a significant one, a never-ending cycle of tasks that would make a modern project manager break out in a cold sweat. A well-managed household reflected well on your husband and your family, suggesting they hadn't accidentally married a complete incompetent, or someone who thought larder was a type of small, furry animal. A poorly managed one. Well, that was your fault, obviously. Even if the rats ate all the grain, the well dried up, a dragon landed on the roof and demanded tribute in the form of sheep, or your husband decided to host an impromptu feast for 50 of his closest and thirstiest friends without prior notice. Still your fault. You should have anticipated the dragon. Outside the home, your movements and interactions were often restricted, like a particularly well-behaved sheep in a very small, very muddy pen. Noblewomen might venture out to attend church, compulsory, and a good place to show off your slightly less stained tunic and exchange meaningful glances with other long-suffering wives. They might visit relatives, with permission of course, and probably a heavily armed escort because medieval roads were not exactly known for their safety or their pleasant scenery. Or perhaps they'd oversee parts of the estate if their husband was particularly enlightened, just lazy, or away at war, which was often, but wandering about unescorted, engaging in frivolous activities like having fun or thinking your own thoughts, was generally frowned upon. It was unseemly, and who knew what sort of trouble a woman might get into if left to her own devices, probably something involving too much thinking, or literacy, or, heaven forbid, opinions. Both highly suspicious activities for a woman likely to lead to social ostracism or accusations of being difficult, which, as we've established, was medieval code for witch. Peasant women had a bit more freedom of movement out of sheer necessity. They weren't swanning about in castles. They were mucking out buyers. They worked in the fields alongside their husbands, went to the market to sell produce, and engage in some light to moderate haggling, gossip, and the occasional heated debate about the price of eggs, and were generally more visible in village life. But their place was still firmly rooted in the family unit, subservient to the male head of household, who probably made all the important decisions, like which pig to slaughter for the feast, whether it was an auspicious day to mend the fence, or if the strange rash on his arm was a sign from God or just a really bad flea bite. Their lives were physically harder, but perhaps offered a sliver more agency in the day-to-day, if only because there was no one else to do the work. Education, as we've touched upon, was limited, and by limited, we mean almost entirely non-existent for most women, unless they were destined for a convent, where they might learn to read Latin and sing slightly off-key. While some noble women learned to read, mostly prayer books, perhaps the occasional scandalous ballad smuggled in by a sympathetic cousin, or a helpful treatise on how to manage a surly husband and still retain your sanity, if such a thing existed, which it probably didn't, and write enough to sign their name, or at least make a vaguely convincing mark that could pass for a signature in poor lighting. Intellectual pursuits were not generally encouraged. A woman's intelligence was best applied to domestic matters, like figuring out how to stretch one chicken to feed a family of 12 for a week, or how to make a convincing argument that the suspicious green tinge on the bread was actually a rare and expensive type of herb. It was certainly not to be wasted on questioning the established order, or, heaven forbid, having opinions on theology, beyond agreeing with the priest, politics beyond agreeing with her husband, or the alarming tendency of the local lord to wear mismatched socks and declare them a bold fashion statement. Such things were best left to men, who were clearly better equipped for the heavy lifting of thinking, which, for some medieval men, appeared to be a genuinely strenuous activity, often accompanied by much frowning, head-scratching, and the consumption of large quantities of ale. Your voice in public affairs? Negligible. Adorable, even, in its utter lack of consequence. Women did not hold public office, unless they were a queen, and even then it was complicated and often involved a lot of male advisers telling her what to do. They did not vote, not that many men did either, in fairness. Voting was more of a theoretical concept, like a well-behaved goat or a pottage that actually tasted good. Their influence was indirect, wielded through their husbands or sons, usually by a carefully timed sigh, a strategically deployed guilt trip, a subtle manipulation of the household budget, or the threat of serving nothing but turnips for a week. A clever woman might advise her husband in private, subtly guiding his decisions, perhaps by suggesting that invading the neighboring village right before harvest season might be inconvenient, or that perhaps antagonizing the heavily armed baron with a notoriously short temper was not the wisest course of action, but openly challenging male authority or expressing an unsolicited opinion in a room full of men was a recipe for trouble, possibly involving accusations of witchcraft, public humiliation, or at the very least, a stern talking to from the priest about the dangers of female presumption and the importance of knowing one's place, which was, again, usually 3 steps behind and silent. And yet, despite these limitations, these societal straitjackets made of wool, disapproval, and a thick layer of patriarchal condescension, medieval women were not simply passive victims, patiently waiting for a knight to rescue them, who would probably just track mud all over the freshly swept rushes anyway, and then expect a hot meal. They were resourceful, resilient, and often wielded considerable informal power within their own spheres. A respected matriarch, the formidable grandmother who had seen it all and wasn't afraid to say so, could influence family decisions, manage vast households with a skill that would make a modern CEO weep into their spreadsheets, and even play a role in arranging marriages and alliances that could shape the fate of kingdoms. Widows, in particular, as we've noted, sometimes gained a degree of independence and control over property that married women lacked, making them surprisingly powerful and often rather terrifying figures, a force to be reckoned with, especially if they had a good lawyer or a son who was good with a sword. They carved out spaces for themselves, found ways to exert influence, and kept the wheels of society turning, even if they rarely got the credit. But the overarching societal structure was clear. A woman's place was defined by her relationship to men, as a daughter, an asset to be married off, a wife, a domestic manager and air producer, a mother, a nurturer and child rearer. Her value was often measured by her fertility, those all-important heirs, her piety, lots of praying, minimal complaining, and a healthy respect for relics of dubious authenticity, and her obedience, maximum nodding, minimum questioning, and an ability to look suitably impressed by even the most boring of male pronouncements. It was a world that offered limited choices and demanded much, often with very little thanks, and even less personal fulfillment by modern standards. So as a young bride, you learned to navigate this world with a combination of pragmatism, patience, a well-developed ability to feign interest in lengthy discussions about crop rotation, the finer points of falconry, or the theological significance of a particularly large cabbage, and perhaps a well-hidden, rebellious streak that only surfaced when you were arguing with the chickens. And let's be honest, the chickens usually won because they were surprisingly good debaters. Your place was defined for you. Making the most of it, finding your own small pockets of joy and agency within those rigid confines, well, that was up to you. And your ability to look extremely interested while your husband explained for the 17th time the finer points of sharpening a sword, why his hunting dog was clearly superior to all other hunting dogs in the known world, or his groundbreaking theory about how to make pottage even more pottage-like. It was a true test of endurance and acting skills. All right. So you're managing the household, or at least preventing it from actively collapsing into a pile of rubble, despair, and disgruntled farm animals, producing heirs, or trying to, amidst a flurry of unsolicited advice, questionable fertility charms, and the lingering fear that your next child might actually be a turnip given your diet, and generally embodying medieval wifely virtue, which mostly involves looking pious, not setting fire to things, intentionally anyway, and pretending you find your husband's jokes amusing. But what about your social life? Were you the medieval equivalent of a Kardashian, attending glittering balls, engaging in witty repartee at salons, and generally being the belle of a local pig fair? Probably not. Unless the Tupperware was filled with slightly fermented turnip, the party was a mandatory and lengthy church service, and glittering referred to the sheen of sweat on everyone's unwashed brow. A young bride's social life was somewhat constrained. It wasn't a whirlwind of parties, engagements, spontaneous weekend getaways to exotic locales, like the next village over if you were feeling particularly adventurous and had a husband who wasn't afraid of bandits or suspiciously aggressive squirrels. It was more a carefully curated series of interactions, largely dictated by her husband's status. Was he a mighty lord or just a slightly less mighty serf? Her family connections, were they influential or mostly just numerous and prone to borrowing money? The ever-watchful eye of the church and community, who had opinions on everything from your hemline to your choice of pottage ingredients, and the availability of a reasonably clean apron, a key indicator of social readiness. For noble women, social life often revolved around the castle or manor, which, while grand in theory, could also feel a bit like a very large, very drafty, and surprisingly boring prison, especially during the long winter months when the main entertainment was watching the tapestries slowly unravel. Visits from other noble families were major events, requiring days, if not weeks, of frantic preparation. This involved a level of domestic upheaval that could rival a small military campaign. Cleaning, or at least hiding the worst of the mess under fresh rushes, stockpiling food, and ale. Never forget the ale for the love of all that is holy. Do not run out of ale. And mentally preparing for endless hours of polite conversation, competitive boasting about whose lineage was more ancient heroic, less prone to embarrassing skin conditions or heretical tendencies, and the delicate art of not offending anyone important, which was basically everyone. If they owned more than 3 sheep, you'd be expected to play the gracious hostess, overseeing the food, which had to be plentiful, even if it wasn't particularly palatable, the entertainment, which might involve a slightly off-key minstrel whose lute had seen better days, and possibly a few too many bar fights, a juggler with questionable hand-eye coordination, or a particularly enthusiastic dog, attempting to join in the dancing. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference. and ensuring that your guests didn't accidentally poison each other. A genuine concern, given medieval food preservation techniques. Start a feud over a misplaced goblet or a perceived slight to their honor, or elope with the stable boy, or, more scandalously, the visiting priest. Witty conversation was appreciated, as long as it wasn't too witty, which might be seen as unfeminine, overly intelligent, or a sign that you'd been reading forbidden books, and certainly not about anything controversial, like rights, or the quality of the ale, unless you were praising it profusely, even if it tasted like old socks, or the fact that Lord Reginald's new tunic made him look like a brightly colored sausage with delusions of grandeur. Such observations were best kept for your private diary, if you had one, and if you could write, and if you weren't afraid your mother-in-law would find it and read it aloud at the next family gathering. Tournaments and hunts were other social occasions, though largely male-dominated. Men got to charge around on horses, hitting each other with sticks. Jousting, they called it, a noble sport for those with more bravery than brains, or chasing terrified animals through the woods with a pack of baying hounds and a great deal of shouting. Women might attend as spectators, dressed in their finest and itchiest wool, admiring the bravery or foolishness of the knights from a safe distance, and trying to look suitably impressed even when Sir Reginald fell off his horse for the third time that afternoon and landed in a large pile of what was hopefully just mud. It was a chance to see and be seen, to gossip with other ladies, mostly about who was wearing what, whose husband was making a fool of himself, and whether Lady Agnes was really pregnant again, or just enjoying the pottage a bit too much, and perhaps to subtly advance your family's interests by catching the eye of an influential lord. For your unmarried sister, of course, you were already spoken for, and probably regretting it, especially when you saw how much mud Sir Reginald was tracking in. Religious festivals and feast days provided more regular opportunities for social interaction. The entire community, from the lord of the manor down to the lowliest turnip peeler, who probably had some very strong opinions about turnips, mostly negative, would gather for Mass, long in Latin and often quite cold. Processions, colorful if a bit disorganized, and perhaps some carefully sanctioned merrymaking, which usually involved a bit more ale, slightly less organized stumbling, and the distinct possibility of someone ending up in the stocks by morning. These were important communal events, reinforcing social bonds, reminding everyone of their place in the divinely ordained hierarchy, with God at the top, then the king, then the nobles, then the men, then the women, then the children, then the livestock, and somewhere near the bottom the turnips, and providing a brief respite from the daily grind. You see your neighbors, exchange pleasantries, mostly about the weather, the state of the crops, or the latest pronouncements from the priest, and perhaps hear the latest village gossip, which was probably about who stole whose pig, whose pottage was looking suspiciously like last week's pig, or which villager was most likely to be accused of witchcraft next. Within the household, your primary companions were your family, including that ever-present, ever-watchful mother-in-law, who was probably your main source of social interaction whether you liked it or not, and servants, who probably knew all your secrets, witnessed all your private moments of despair, and were just waiting for the right moment to use this information to their advantage, or at least to get an extra helping of pottage. Friendships with other women were important, offering solace, support, and a shared understanding of the unique challenges of medieval life, like how to get a stubborn goat out of the kitchen without resorting to violence, how to subtly poison your husband's least favorite hunting dog, hypothetically of course, unless he was really annoying, or how to look busy and pious when the priest made an unexpected visit. You might confide in your sisters, if they hadn't already been married off to distant, equally problematic lords, your cousins, if they weren't actively trying to undermine you, or other ladies of the household, if you could find any who weren't too busy with their own domestic crises. These relationships, forged in the crucible of shared chores, societal expectations, a mutual appreciation for a well-brewed cup of probably weak herbal tea, and a collective eye-roll whenever a man started explaining something obvious, were often deep and enduring. They were the support network that kept many medieval women sane, or at least slightly less insane, For peasant women, social life was more integrated into the fabric of daily work and village life. There were no formal invitations, no calling cards, no medieval equivalent of a Facebook event. The market was a key social hub, a place to sell goods, a few eggs, a slightly lopsided basket you wove yourself, buy necessities, salt if you were lucky, or a new wooden spoon to replace the one the goat ate, engage in some light to moderate haggling, a vital skill, often involving more dramatic gestures than actual words, and catch up on all the news and gossip that was fit to, and often unfit to share. Working together in the fields during harvest time, spinning wool in communal groups, a medieval knitting circle, but with more complaining about the quality of the fleece and the general unfairness of life, or gathering at the village well, the medieval water cooler, where all the best rumors were exchanged. These were all opportunities for social interaction, for sharing burdens, for complaining about husbands, children, livestock, and for collectively sighing about the state of the world. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were also important communal events, bringing the entire village together to celebrate, mourn, consume slightly more pottage than usual, and possibly engage in a bit of ritualized weeping. But for all women, regardless of class, there were boundaries, invisible fences, patrolled by societal expectation, religious doctrine, and the fear of scandal, which could ruin your life, and possibly get you accused of being in league with the devil, who was apparently very interested in minor social transgressions. Unchaperoned excursions were rare, and generally involved a lot of suspicious glaring from passers-by, and the assumption that you were up to no good, which, to be fair, you might have been, if no good involved trying to find 5 minutes of peace and quiet away from your screaming children and your demanding mother-in-law. Friendships with men outside the family were viewed with extreme suspicion, and could lead to your reputation being shredded faster than a cabbage in a medieval kitchen, or a particularly enthusiastic badger. Your reputation was a fragile thing, easily tarnished by rumor, perceived impropriety, simply by being seen laughing too loudly in public, or by wearing a hat deemed too jaunty by the local busybody. A good wife was a virtuous wife, and virtue often meant keeping to your own sphere, avoiding any hint of scandal, generally being as exciting as a damp Tuesday, and cultivating an air of perpetual, mild disapproval. So your social life as a young medieval bride wasn't about wild nights out clubbing, unless clubbing referred to beating laundry against a rock with a large wooden implement, which was a common Tuesday afternoon activity. It was about carefully navigating a complex web of relationships, obligations, and expectations. It was about finding connection and companionship within a tightly structured world, like a particularly determined ivy finding a crack in a stone wall and clinging on for dear life. It was about making the most of the limited opportunities for interaction, sharing a knowing glance with another woman over the heads of the oblivious men, and perhaps, just perhaps, finding a moment or two of genuine laughter amidst the endless pottage, piety, and pig-related crises. And if you were really lucky, someone might even tell a joke that didn't involve a turnip, or a priest, or a turnip-loving priest with a penchant for off-key singing and questionable theological interpretations. One could only hope, but mostly one just sighed and got on with the mending. We've talked about the business of marriage, mostly involving cows, strategic alliances, and a surprising amount of paperwork, probably written on sheepskin. We've discussed the drudgery of daily life, pottage, and more pottage, with a side of existential despair. We've touched upon the terror of childbirth, a delightful game of will I survive this, and if so, will the baby also survive, or will it be eaten by a badger? But what about romance, that elusive, shimmering, often entirely fictional concept? Surely, amidst all the practicality, pottage, and plague avoidance, there was room for a little love, a little passion, a little of that heart-fluttering, swoon-worthy, make-you-want-to-write bad poetry stuff that minstrels were always singing about, when they weren't singing about battles, heroic sheep, or the tragic tale of Sir Reginald and the particularly stubborn jam stain on his favorite tunic. Well, yes, and no, mostly no, if we're being brutally honest, but with occasional surprising and often quite confusing outbreaks of yes. like finding a non-moldy piece of bread in the pantry, or a day when your mother-in-law was inexplicably cheerful and didn't criticize your pottage stirring technique even once. Miracles did happen, occasionally. Let's be clear, marriage in the medieval period, especially for the nobility, who had more land to worry about and more alliances to forge, was rarely based on romantic love. As we've established, it was a transaction, an alliance, a strategic move in the great game of medieval power, played with human chess pieces who often had very little say in the matter and were mostly concerned with not getting checkmated by the plague. You married the person your family chose for you, usually based on their land holdings, their connections, their impressive collection of slightly dented armor, their ability to produce a male heir who wasn't obviously an imbecile, or simply because they were the only vaguely suitable candidate within a 50-mile radius who wasn't already married, a priest, or a goat, and you were expected to make the best of it. Love, if it developed at all, was a bonus, a happy accident, like finding a coin in the pocket of an old tunic, or discovering that your new husband didn't snore like a congested dragon. It was certainly not a prerequisite. Expecting to marry for love in the Middle Ages was like expecting a unicorn to deliver your groceries or a politician to tell the unvarnished truth. A lovely idea, but not exactly grounded in the harsh, ale-soaked reality of the times. The concept of courtly love, which we hear about in medieval literature, all those knights pining for unobtainable ladies, writing tortured poetry, and performing daring deeds in their honor, was largely a literary ideal, a fashionable pastime for the bored aristocracy. It was a game played by knights and ladies, often outside the bonds of marriage. Because where's the fun in pining for someone you actually have to share a bed, a chamber pot, and a lifetime of mutual disappointment with? It involved elaborate rituals of devotion, secret glances across crowded mead halls, often obscured by smoke and a thick fog of unwashed humanity, poetic declarations, often of questionable quality, and probably plagiarized from a slightly more talented minstrel, and a whole lot of pining, and probably a fair amount of chafing from all that armor, which can't have been conducive to romantic serenades or spontaneous declarations of passion. It was more about the performance of love, the aesthetic of longing, the thrill of the forbidden, than the reality of it. And it certainly wasn't the basis for choosing a life partner who you'd be sharing a drafty castle, questionable hygiene, a lifetime supply of turnip-based dishes, and his extensive collection of hunting dogs, who probably got more affection and certainly better food than you did, with for the next several decades. The dogs, at least, were usually loyal. So as a young bride, you likely entered marriage with few romantic illusions. Your husband was your partner in managing the estate, producing heirs. The primary objective, let's be honest, everything else was just window dressing, and maintaining the family's social standing, which often involved not laughing when he told the same boar hunting story for the 15th time that week, or when he tried to impress visitors with his knowledge of obscure saints. Affection might grow over time, born of shared experiences, like surviving a particularly harsh winter, a visit from his even more terrifying aunt, or a joint effort to dislodge a bat from the bedchamber. Mutual respect, perhaps for your ability to make pottage that didn't actively try to fight back, or his surprising talent for fixing a leaky roof with nothing but mud and determination, or simply the resigned acceptance of a shared fate, or it might not. Many medieval marriages were, by modern standards, emotionally barren, functioning more like a business partnership with occasional, awkward, and often rather perfunctory conjugal duties, performed with all the passion of a tax audit. However, this doesn't mean that love and affection didn't exist. Human nature being what it is, a stubborn, often inconvenient, and occasionally quite beautiful thing, people did fall in love, even within the constraints of arranged marriages. A distinct lack of dating apps, and a social scene that mostly revolved around church and the occasional public execution. Letters and poems from the period, the few that survived and weren't eaten by mice, used as kindling or repurposed as toilet paper, sometimes revealed genuine tenderness, longing, and deep emotional connection between spouses. Shared hardships, like a failed harvest or a visit from the tax collector. The joy of children, those that survived the gauntlet of medieval childhood and didn't immediately try to set fire to the cat, and the simple companionship of daily life, of knowing there was someone else in the hut who also hated that one particularly loud rooster, or who understood your silent despair when faced with yet another bowl of turnip stew, could forge powerful bonds. Sometimes, against all odds, genuine affection blossomed in the muddy soil of medieval matrimony. But expressions of love were different, more subtle, less Hollywood. There were no grand romantic gestures involving flash mobs or serenades from beneath balconies, mostly because balconies were rare, and flash mobs would have been mistaken for a peasant uprising and swiftly suppressed. Public displays of affection were generally frowned upon, considered unseemly, a bit vulgar, or a sign that you'd been drinking too much of the good ale. Romance was a private affair, expressed in small, often unspoken gestures, a shared piece of bread when food was scarce, a moment of quiet understanding in a crowded room, a particularly thoughtful gift, like a new spinning wheel that was only slightly used and didn't make too many alarming creaking noises, or a pig that didn't bite, or perhaps just a moment of uninterrupted silence. Quiet words, a lingering touch when no one was looking, or perhaps just not complaining when he tracked mud through the freshly swept rushes for the third time that day. These were the love languages of the medieval era. It was a love built on shared endurance, rather than shared hobbies or a mutual appreciation for artisanal coffee. For peasant couples, who often had a bit more say in their choice of partner, though economic considerations, the approval of the village elders, and the availability of a reasonably sound hut were still paramount, marriages might have had a stronger foundation of personal affection. They chose each other, or at least weren't actively forced into a union with someone they despised, most of the time. Working side by side in the fields, sharing the struggles of daily life, like trying to convince a stubborn donkey to move, figuring out what to do when the well ran dry, or dealing with a leaky roof that seemed to have a personal vendetta against their bed, and raising a family together in close quarters, very close quarters, often with the aforementioned livestock, who were practically part of the family, albeit the smellier, less articulate part, could foster a deep, if unglamorous bond. There wasn't much time for candlelit dinners or romantic getaways, unless you counted a trip to the next village to sell a pig as a getaway. But there was a shared reality, a partnership forged in mud, sweat, and the occasional shared laugh over a particularly stupid sheep. But the overriding expectation for noble and peasant alike was duty. Your duty to your husband, to obey him, to bear his children, to not poison his pottage even when sorely tempted. Your duty to your family, to uphold their honor, to not embarrass them by, say, eloping with a traveling minstrel. Your duty to your lineage, to produce those all-important male heirs, and your duty to the local priest, who always seemed to need more donations for the church roof or for his new, surprisingly comfortable shoes. Love was a pleasant but ultimately secondary consideration. A luxury, not a necessity. If you found it, you were lucky. You cherished it. You held on to it like a precious, fragile thing. If you didn't, well, there was always embroidery, and the comforting thought that everyone else was probably in the same boat. A very large, very leaky, and not particularly romantic boat. Possibly with a goat in it. There was always a goat, and the goat at least was usually consistent in its affections, mostly for your cabbages. So did young medieval brides dream of knights in shining armor, sweeping them off their feet and carrying them away to a life of adventure and passion? Perhaps. The minstrels certainly sang enough songs about it to plant the idea. But they probably also dreamed of a husband who didn't snore too loudly, a rare and precious commodity, who remembered to wipe his feet before coming inside, a revolutionary concept practically unheard of, who occasionally brought home a decent cut of meat that wasn't already green, actively moving, or suspiciously cheap, and who didn't consider grunting to be a primary form of communication. Romance, medieval style, was about finding the small sparks of warmth in a world that was often cold, hard, and distinctly unswoon-worthy. It was about appreciating the man who could fix a leaky roof, even if he couldn't write a sonnet to save his life, and probably thought a sonnet was a type of small, pointy hat. It was about shared laughter over a burnt dinner, a moment of quiet companionship by the fire, or the simple comfort of knowing you weren't facing the terrifying medieval world entirely alone. And sometimes, if you were very, very fortunate, those sparks might just catch fire, or at least smolder pleasantly for a few decades, providing a bit of warmth against the ever-present medieval chill, and a brief respite from the endless, soul-crushing pottage. You've navigated betrothal, the human equivalent of being put on hold indefinitely, with slightly ominous background music. You've survived marriage, a contract with more clauses about cows, land, and obedience than actual affection. You've endured childbirth, multiple times probably, each a delightful game of Russian roulette with your uterus and the local midwife's questionable hygiene. You've mastered household management, a constant battle against chaos, dust, sentient pottage, and the inexplicable tendency of socks to disappear into another dimension. And you've somehow managed to not succumb to the distinct lack of decent plumbing, or indeed any plumbing that didn't involve a bucket and a strong sense of resignation. You've somehow avoided dying from the plague, a minor miracle, a badly aimed arrow, less of a miracle, more just good dodging skills, a particularly aggressive turnip, a surprisingly common medieval hazard, or sheer, unadulterated boredom. Congratulations, young medieval bride. You're approaching old age, which, in medieval terms, could be anywhere from your late 30s, to which point you were practically a relic, possibly even bronzed and put on display as a testament to unusual longevity, to your 50s, if you were exceptionally hardy, incredibly lucky, possessed a cast-iron constitution, or had made a pact with a minor deity involving the sacrifice of many, many turnips. Life expectancy in the medieval period was not great. It was, to put it mildly, tragically short, like a badly written ballad that ended abruptly mid-verse. As we've discussed, high infant and child mortality rates dragged the averages down, making the actuarial tables look like a horror story penned by a particularly pessimistic monk. But even if you survived the perilous gauntlet of childhood, a feat in itself akin to winning a joust against a dragon while blindfolded and slightly tipsy on weak ale, reaching what we'd consider middle age was a significant achievement, worthy of a small, slightly bewildered celebration, probably involving more pottage. Life was physically demanding. Medical care was rudimentary at best, often involving more prayer, leeches, and questionable herbal concoctions than actual medicine, and the world was generally trying to kill you in a variety of interesting, unpleasant, and often quite smelly ways. Every day you woke up not dead was a small victory. So what did old age look like for a medieval woman who had been a young bride, and had somehow managed to cling to existence like a particularly tenacious limpet on a storm-battered rock? What awaited her in her twilight years, assuming her twilight didn't arrive prematurely around the age of 32? If you were a noblewoman, and your husband had conveniently predeceased you, a common occurrence given their fondness for warfare, questionable hunting practices that often involved antagonizing very large, very angry animals, generally making poor life choices involving sharp objects, and over-reliance on ale as a primary source of hydration, and a diet that would make a modern cardiologist weep into his stethoscope, you might find yourself in a position of considerable power, and, dare we say it, even a modicum of freedom as a widow. Suddenly, you weren't just Lady Griselda, wife of Lord Reginald the Slightly Gassy. You were the Lady Griselda, Dowager of Drafty Keep, a formidable figure in your own right, and people, even your own ungrateful children, had to listen to you, or at least pretend to. You could inherit and manage his estates, or at least the bits the male relatives, vultures in ermine, hadn't managed to grab through complex legal wrangling or outright theft. You could wield significant influence over your children and grandchildren, who probably still didn't listen, but at least pretended to, especially if you controlled the purse strings or the biscuit tin. And you could enjoy a degree of autonomy that was rare for married women, like deciding what color tunic to wear without consulting a committee of male relatives, or even having an opinion on the quality of the ale. Some widows became formidable matriarchs, respected and perhaps slightly feared for their wisdom, born of years of suffering and observation, experience mostly in dealing with incompetent men, iron will, forged in the fires of endless domestic crises, and uncanny ability to know when someone was sneaking extra biscuits from the pantry, or plotting to marry off her favorite granddaughter to that odious Baron von Snout. Of course, there was always the pressure to remarry, to secure the family line, bring in a new alliance, find someone to complain about the quality of the ale with, or simply because a woman alone was considered a bit suspicious, like an unattended goat. But a wealthy, well-connected widow had options, and sometimes those options involved telling everyone to leave her alone with her embroidery, her surprisingly large collection of very opinionated cats, and her secret stash of surprisingly good wine, if your husband was still around. The stubborn old goat, clinging to life with the same tenacity he clung to his favorite moth-eaten chair. Your role would continue to be that of household manager and matriarch, though perhaps with a bit more respect and authority earned through years of service, decades of putting up with his nonsense, or simply because everyone else was too tired, too intimidated, or too busy with their own existential crises to argue with you anymore. Your children would be grown, possibly married themselves, and now you could be the terrifying mother-in-law, a role you'd been practicing for decades, honing your critical gaze and your repertoire of disapproving sighs, and you'd be dealing with the joys of grandchildren, who were adorable, until they started asking difficult questions like, "Grandmama, why does the castle smell like old socks, regret, and a hint of decomposing rodent?" Or, "Grandmama, is it true you once set fire to Uncle Ethelred's beard?" And you'd probably still be mediating feuds between your adult sons, usually over who got the biggest chicken leg at dinner, who inherited the slightly less rusty suit of armor, or whose turn it was to visit their terrifying Aunt Mildred. Your health would likely be variable, and by variable we mean mostly bad, with occasional moments of feeling slightly less awful, usually right before something else went wrong. Years of hard work, multiple pregnancies, each one a physiological marathon run while simultaneously juggling flaming torches and fending off wolves, and a medieval diet, heavy on the bread, light on the vitamins, and surprisingly reliant on turnips, would have taken their toll. Aches and pains were a given, a constant companion, like an invisible, very annoying goblin poking you with a tiny rust-covered spear. Your teeth, if you still had any that weren't actively trying to escape your mouth or stage a rebellion, were probably not your best feature. They were more like historical landmarks of past meals, each one telling a silent, slightly crumbly story of pottages past. Your eyesight might be failing, making embroidery an even more challenging and stabby pursuit, and leading to awkward social situations where you accidentally curtsied to a goat. But you were a survivor. You'd seen things, you knew things, like the best way to get a wine stain out of a wool tunic. Answer: you don't, you just call it a design feature, or blame it on the cat. And you weren't afraid to tell people about them, loudly and repeatedly, especially if they were young and looked like they weren't appreciating their relatively pain-free existence. For a peasant woman, old age meant continuing to work for as long as physically possible, because retirement was a mythical concept, like a dragon that did its own laundry, or a lord who paid his taxes on time. There was no pension plan, no leisurely afternoons spent playing bingo in a climate-controlled hall, unless bingo involved guessing which turnip would rot first, and the hall was a drafty barn. You'd contribute to the household in whatever way you could, minding grandchildren, who were probably just as sticky, noisy, and prone to mischief as your own children had been, if not more so. Spinning wool. Your fingers knew the motions even if your brain had checked out and was currently reliving a particularly traumatic encounter with a goose from 1347, tending the garden if your back allowed it, and if the rabbits hadn't eaten everything again, offering unsolicited advice to your daughters-in-law, who would ignore it, just as you had ignored your own mother-in-law's well-intentioned, but ultimately useless advice about the proper way to swaddle a baby or appease a grumpy pig. You were a repository of traditional knowledge, of herbal remedies, some of which actually worked, and some of which just made you smell interesting, of stories and songs, most of them about how hard life was, how unfair the Lord was, or how that one goat was definitely possessed by a mischievous demon with a penchant for eating laundry and important documents. Your value to the family remained, even as your physical strength waned. Your ability to chase down an errant chicken diminished, and your pronouncements became increasingly eccentric. Appearance-wise, let's just say medieval skincare was not advanced. The fountain of youth was probably just a muddy puddle somewhere, possibly guarded by a very grumpy frog, and nobody had found it yet. Wrinkles were a fact of life, a road map of your experiences, each one a testament to a winter survived, a famine endured, or a pottage-related crisis averted. Hair turned gray, or fell out, or was strategically hidden under a wimple that had seen better centuries. Sun, wind, and hard labor etched themselves onto your face, creating a look that was less glowing with youthful vitality, and more carved from a particularly resilient piece of old wood. But these were marks of a life lived, not something to be erased with expensive creams, Botox, or surgical interventions. Mostly because expensive creams hadn't been invented, unless you counted goose grease as a cream. Botox was still several centuries away from being weaponized for cosmetic purposes, and surgery was more likely to kill you than make you look younger. And besides, who had time to worry about wrinkles when there were turnips to be hoed and souls to be saved? And what about your inner life? As an older woman, you might have more time for reflection, in between chores and naps and complaining about your joints. More time for piety, because at this point, hedging your bets with the Almighty and trying to get on His good side seemed like a sensible precaution, especially with all those plague rumors flying about. More time for enjoying the small comforts of life, a warm fire, if you could get the damp wood to light, a good story, even if you'd heard it 100 times and knew all the good bits by heart, the presence of your family, even if they were all incredibly annoying, and kept asking you where you'd hidden the good ale. You'd seen generations come and go. You'd witnessed joy and sorrow, hardship and resilience. You were a living link to the past, a walking, talking history book, albeit one that complained about its joints a lot, and had some very strong opinions about the proper way to make pottage, which, of course, no one else ever got quite right. Death, when it came, was an accepted part of life, not a taboo subject to be whispered about in hushed tones and avoided at all costs. It was the inevitable conclusion to a often difficult, frequently uncomfortable, and occasionally quite bewildering story. Funerals were important rituals, a final farewell, a chance for the community to gather, consume a bit more ale, and speculate about who would inherit your slightly lopsided spinning wheel. And, of course, a prayer for the soul's journey into the great unknown, which hopefully had better ale, fewer turnips, and significantly less mud. You'd be buried in the churchyard, hopefully with a simple marker, if your family could afford it, and if the priest wasn't too busy. Your life's work done, your pottage-stirring days finally over. Your legacy would live on in your children, those that survived, your stories, those that were remembered, and perhaps in a particularly stubborn patch of herbs you once planted in the garden. Surviving to old age in the medieval period was no small feat. It meant you were tough, resourceful, probably had a very robust immune system, or had just been lucky enough to avoid the really nasty germs, and a healthy suspicion of anyone offering you medicinal eels or a guaranteed cure for anything. As a former young bride, you'd have weathered storms that would make modern reality TV contestants weep into their avocado toast and demand a therapist. You'd have loved, lost, toiled, and endured. You'd have seen more hardship than most people see in a dozen lifetimes. And in your own quiet, unglamorous, and probably quite smelly way, you'd have been a legend. At least to the chickens, they probably remembered you fondly, or with a healthy dose of fear, depending on how dinner usually went at your house, and whether you were known for your skill with a cleaver. You were, in short, a medieval badass, even if no one ever called you that to your wrinkled, world-weary face. And so our journey through the fragrant, not really, unless you find the aroma of unwashed humanity, livestock, and despair fragrant, joy-filled, occasionally, if you squinted very hard and had consumed a significant quantity of ale, and not at all perilous. Ha! If by not perilous you mean constantly teetering on the brink of death from plague, famine, or a badly aimed turnip. Life of a young medieval bride comes to a close. Are you packing your bags, polishing your resume for the position of slightly used but still serviceable political pawn? Ready to trade your smartphone with its access to all human knowledge and cat videos? for a spinning wheel that seems to have a personal vendetta against your fingers, and a tendency to produce lopsided yarn, eager to swap your central heating for a smoky hearth that offers more ambiance, of the am I about to die of smoke inhalation variety, than actual warmth, prepared to exchange your complicated relationship with gluten for a very uncomplicated and deeply personal relationship with pottage, which, let's face it, was probably gluten-free by virtue of containing very little actual food and mostly just boiled sadness? I thought not. You're looking a bit pale. Perhaps you need a nice cup of, well, not medieval water, that's for sure. That stuff could probably dissolve spoons. Maybe a strong cup of modern filtered non-plague-infested tea, and a lie down. Let's be honest. Being a young bride in the medieval times was a mixed bag. And by mixed bag, I mean a bag that was mostly filled with rocks, representing your crushing responsibilities, damp wool, representing your perpetually uncomfortable clothing and the general miasma of your existence, existential uncertainty, representing your constant awareness of your own mortality, and the whims of fate, God your husband, a surprising number of spiders, who were probably better company than some of your relatives, with perhaps one very small, slightly bruised berry of joy at the bottom, if you were lucky enough to find it before the rats did, and a disgruntled field mouse who'd also had enough and was seriously considering becoming a hermit. You were a political pawn in a game played by men who probably couldn't spell strategy, but were very good at shouting and waving sharp objects. You were a domestic workhorse, expected to perform miracles with limited resources, even more limited enthusiasm, and a distinct lack of modern appliances, unless you count a very stubborn goat as a labor-saving device, which it most certainly was not. You were a baby-making machine, with the warranty expiring alarmingly quickly, and the quality control often leaving much to be desired. And you were the unfortunate inheritor of some truly questionable hygiene standards, which made close social interactions an act of bravery, and kissing a potentially life-threatening gamble. Your childhood was an apprenticeship for drudgery, where fun was a misspelled word in a forgotten language, and playtime usually involved chores disguised as amusement, like chase the escaped chicken or find the missing spoon. Your wedding was a business transaction with slightly more ale than usual, a distinct possibility of your new father-in-law challenging someone to a duel over the quality of the roast swan, or the perceived insult in your dowry cow's left nostril, and the quiet sinking feeling that you'd just signed away your soul for 3 cows and a slightly leaky roof. Your home was drafty, your food was bland, unless you counted burnt as a flavor, or surprisingly crunchy due to the inclusion of weevils, and your primary form of entertainment was trying to guess which of your children would survive to adulthood, which farm animal would make it through the winter without becoming stew, or which of your relatives would be the next to offer unsolicited and usually terrible advice on child-rearing, pottage-making the proper way to appease the local saint. Romance was a literary genre, not a life plan. Unless your life plan involved a lot of unrequited sighing, poorly composed poetry about the unattainable beauty of Lady Cunegonde, who probably had terrible teeth and smelled faintly of old cheese, and the constant nagging fear that your beloved might be carried off by the plague, a rival lord with a bigger sword, or a particularly aggressive badger. Your legal rights were adorable in their near non-existence, like a particularly fluffy but entirely powerless kitten, or a turnip with strong opinions but no way to express them. Your social life was a carefully choreographed dance of obligation, gossip, trying not to offend anyone important, which was basically everyone, especially if they owned more land or a sharper pointy stick than you did, and wondering if anyone else noticed that Lord Ethelbert's toupee was slipping. And your healthcare plan mostly involved leeches, who were always hungry, hoping for the best, a notoriously unreliable strategy, and a strong suspicion that the local barber surgeon was just making things up as he went along, possibly based on the alignment of the stars or the behavior of his prize-winning pig. He probably was. The pig, however, might have had some surprisingly good diagnostic insights. And yet, through all the muck and misery, the pottage and the patriarchy, these women endured. They didn't just survive. They lived in their own stubborn, resilient, and often surprisingly resourceful way. They ran households that were miniature kingdoms of chaos, but kingdoms nonetheless. They raised families against incredible odds, loving fiercely even in the face of constant loss, and somehow managing to instill a few basic life lessons, like don't eat the glowing mushrooms, and try not to anger the man with the axe in their often feral offspring. They managed estates, sometimes more competently than their often absent, entirely incompetent, or just plain drunk husbands, and they found ways to carve out moments of joy, companionship, and meaning in a world that was often brutal, unforgiving, and smelled faintly of unwashed socks and simmering resentment. They were resilient, like a particularly determined weed pushing its way through a crack in a castle wall, or a pottage stain that simply refused to be scrubbed away. They were resourceful, able to make a feast out of 3 turnips, a prayer, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. They were the backbone of medieval society, the silent, often unthanked engine that kept the whole rickety, mud-splattered enterprise from collapsing into a bile of despair and goat droppings, even if the history books, mostly written by men, about men for men, often forgot to mention them, or only mentioned them in relation to which powerful man they married, which scandalous rumor they inspired, or which particularly impressive tapestry they embroidered, while slowly losing their minds. They found strength in their faith, even if God seemed to be permanently on vacation, or at least very selective with his miracles. They found strength in their families, even the annoying ones who borrowed your best wimple and never returned it. They found strength in their communities, even the gossipy ones who knew your business before you did. They passed down traditions, skills, stories, and probably a few really good recipes for pottage that didn't taste entirely of despair, and might even contain an identifiable vegetable if you were lucky. They loved, sometimes. They laughed, occasionally, when no one important was looking. They grieved often and deeply, and they kept going, because that's what humans do. Even when the pottage is thin, the winter is long, the Lord is demanding more taxes, and the local priest has once again decided to deliver a 3-hour sermon on the evils of dancing, or jaunty hats. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm bed with your clean sheets, your indoor plumbing, a miracle of modern engineering that would have made a medieval bride weep with joy, and your distinct lack of resident livestock. Unless you have a very unusual pet or a particularly adventurous hamster, spare a thought for Alara or Agnes or Griselda. She might not have had an easy life. She certainly didn't have a glamorous one. Unless you find chronic dampness, itchy wool, and the constant threat of dysentery glamorous. But she had a life, and she lived it in all its messy, challenging, occasionally terrifying, surprisingly goat-filled, and ultimately quite extraordinary medieval glory. She probably had some very strong opinions about the proper way to darn a sock, the best way to appease a grumpy husband, usually involving ale, the most effective method for removing stubborn pottage stains from a tunic, a closely guarded secret passed down through generations of long-suffering women, and the exact number of prayers required to ward off a toothache. Answer: a lot, and it usually didn't work anyway. And that's something, that's a legacy, and who knows, maybe just maybe, somewhere in the great beyond, in a heaven that hopefully has decent sanitation and a distinct lack of feudal lords, she's finally enjoying a decent cup of tea, that isn't just boiled nettles and regret, a piece of bread that doesn't require a chisel and a team of engineers to eat, and a really, really long bath, without a goat watching, or trying to join in, and with actual soap. The good stuff. She's earned it. Good night. Sleep tight, and don't let the bedbugs, or the existential weight of historical perspective, or the ghost of a disgruntled turnip with unfinished business, or the lingering fear that your mother-in-law might somehow manifest and critique your sleeping posture bite.